Sometimes kindness becomes the knife you drive into your own heart. We believe in the good in people, we trust, help, and try to save them. But sometimes this blind faith in the idea of redemption creates monsters. That's exactly what happened to Harold, a successful businessman and upstanding citizen who decided to offer a helping hand to a young woman with a troubled past. He had no idea that his kindness would spark a bloody tragedy. Sarah McLinn, fragile, quiet, and seemingly timid on the outside, hid a darkness that had been growing inside her for years. Those around her only saw the surface and had no clue that inside, Sarah harbored thoughts that would send chills down anyone's spine. Harold's kindness turned out to be his downfall. It awakened desires in Sarah that no one would dare speak of. And one night, it all came to a deadly end. At dawn, Harold's body was found in his own home, his throat slit, with a barely visible message written in blood. The air was thick with despair, and on the dead man's lips was a disturbing mix of terror and acceptance. It was as if death hadn't come for him, but had been invited. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. A few hours before the crime, she took her prescription meds, the ones she knew would ignite her rage and thirst for blood. At the same time, she gave Harold a sedative, waiting until he drifted off into a sleep he would never wake from. But when she looked at his lifeless body, all she felt was emptiness. According to the prosecutor, the detailed planning and preparation for the crime proved that Sarah wasn't insane, and so she was set to face justice behind bars. During questioning, Sarah admitted she had left her phone and tablet in the kitchen on purpose, making sure she couldn't be tracked. Instead, she stole another phone and used it to call her family from a gas station before fleeing. She packed her belongings, everything she thought she'd need, and drove as far as she could. Eventually, she stopped in a remote area, spending several days sleeping in her car, living on fast food, and plotting her next move. But eventually, guilt started to eat away at her. Sarah felt sick and fell into deep despair. By the time she was found, she was in terrible shape. During questioning, she confessed that she had wanted to see someone die. Law enforcement latched onto this statement, disregarding her claims of being a victim of abuse, and labeled her a psychopath with a desire to kill. Sarah fell into the 7% of confirmed cases uncovered through psychological research. It was believed that the first signs of trouble appeared during her teenage years when she was sexually abused. This trauma triggered the emergence of multiple personalities, one of which was Vanessa, timid and scared, just like Sarah. But the other Alice was her polar opposite, violent, aggressive, always suspicious, and ready to take action to protect the other alter egos. While speaking with psychiatrists in prison, Sarah made another shocking statement. She revealed that the man she killed had actually abused her, despite having set her up in life. He had offered her a good salary, a place to live, and genuinely acted as a mentor. But in return, he demanded sexual favors. Sarah said that over time, she felt trapped. She had initially gone along with his advances to solve her life problems, but instead, she gained new ones that she couldn't handle. She felt he had been using her. During this period, her personalities started to clash. Vanessa wanted to end her own life, while Alice became a full-blown defense mechanism, amplified by a new medication Sarah had been prescribed. This conflict is what drove Sarah to commit the crime. At that moment, Alice took full control of Sarah's body and murdered the man. She slashed his throat brutally, relishing the power she had over her victim. As the execution took place, Sarah's more passive personalities faded into the background, becoming mere observers. It's important to note that while Sarah harbored multiple personalities, only Alice was violent and truly malevolent. According to Sarah, her kinder personalities tried to stop Alice, but they couldn't. Despite this, Sarah's lawyer argued that she should not be imprisoned. The defense claimed that Sarah was not mentally competent and was suffering from severe psychological disorders. In fact, Sarah was unable to attend several court hearings due to the worsening of her mental health. The defense attorney was outraged that Sarah had given a confession during her initial interrogation. According to psychiatrists, it was unclear which of her alter egos was in control of her body at the time. Each of Sarah's personalities told a different story, with only Alice claiming that Harold had abused her, while the others denied it. However, investigators did manage to find evidence of harassment from Harold. He had sent messages to Sarah, hinting at inappropriate behavior. But this was ignored in the investigation. After the shocking crime and during the interrogation, the investigator took another drag of his cigarette and asked, "So Sarah, how did it come to this?" Her gaze grew distant. Her thoughts seemed to unravel, drifting back to a time when things were different. A time without knives, blood, or fear. Several years had passed since it all started. But in her mind, it felt like just yesterday. Let's take a step back and get to know Sarah and Harold. Sarah McLinn was born in 1994 in Topeka, the capital of Kansas. She was an ordinary girl, energetic, sociable, and sweet, with long dark hair. In her childhood, Sarah had a wide range of interests and hobbies. Her parents decided to homeschool her. However, not everything was perfect. A neighbor began to harass her, leaving her with deep psychological trauma. As a teenager, Sarah faced typical adolescent problems, which were worsened by family disputes over property following her parents' divorce. During this time, she was also assaulted by a boy she knew, and the neighbor's harassment continued, causing Sarah to avoid being at home as much as possible. In an attempt to cope, Sarah began drinking and dating various guys, hoping to find love, but it didn't help. She suffered a nervous breakdown and even attempted suicide, which led to her being hospitalized in a psychiatric clinic. After her discharge, Sarah continued taking prescribed medications. Harold Sasko was born in 1961. He was a driven man, known for working around the clock. Harold dreamed of building a successful business and becoming wealthy, so he started working at 14. His hard work paid off. After years of managing restaurants, he gained enough money and experience to open his own business. Eventually, he became the owner of 3 franchise pizza shops in Topeka and Lawrence. Harold was well established in the restaurant industry long before he ever met Sarah. Now, let's go back to how it all started, with Sarah and Harold's first meeting, and how an act of kindness turned into something far more brutal. In January 2014, the family of prominent businessman Harold Sasko suddenly lost contact with him. As detectives began their investigation, more chilling details about his violent death came to light. It was such a calculated and cold-blooded crime that questions about the fairness of the criminal's punishment continue to spark debates to this day. But what if Harold wasn't the man everyone thought he was? Could it be that behind his outward success lay dark secrets that, in the mind of the killer, justified the crime? This shocking case soon became national news and even inspired a book. At the center of the story was 19-year-old Sarah McLinn, sweet, sociable, and seemingly harmless. Shortly before the crime, she had been living with her employer, Harold Sasko. His family described him as a successful businessman with a complex personality, quick-tempered, controlling, and prone to dominating his relationships. While Harold could sometimes come off as harsh, none of his loved ones could ever believe he deserved such a gruesome fate. The main characters of this case lived in the quiet town of Lawrence, Kansas, a place where life moved at a slow pace and everyone knew everyone. With a population of fewer than 100,000, the town was far from the chaos of big cities, and such brutality was unheard of. But on January 17, 2014, everything changed when the local police received a call from a teenager who lived near the Lawrence campus. He reported hearing strange and frightening sounds coming from the apartment upstairs. Police were dispatched to investigate. It was already around 11 p.m., and the apartment appeared still. No one answered the door, though the lights inside were on. Officers surveyed the area, looking for a way inside. When they peered through one of the windows, their hearts stopped. A man was lying on the floor, and it was clear he wasn't alive. The officers entered the apartment through the back door and found Harold Sasko. His throat had been slashed with such force that it seemed as if his head was barely attached to his neck. There were pools of dried blood everywhere, and the horror of the scene shook even the most seasoned officers. No one could fathom who could commit such a heinous act. The Lawrence police, accustomed to the quiet life of a small town, were suddenly thrust into the midst of the most savage crime they had ever encountered. Detectives soon discovered that at the time of Harold Sasko's death, 19-year-old college student Sarah McLinn had been living with him. However, there was no trace of her in the house. Initially, there was speculation that Sarah might have been the second victim of an unknown criminal who brutally murdered the businessman and possibly kidnapped her. Sarah was the last person to see Harold alive. But what happened to her afterward remained a mystery. Friends and acquaintances claimed that Harold was not just Sarah's employer. He was a mentor and a role model. She looked to him for support, something she had lacked after the breakdown of her relationship with her biological father. Sarah had always had a strained relationship with her parents, especially after their divorce. When she started college, she moved in with Harold, and despite their significant age difference, they became friends. On the morning that Harold's body was discovered, Sarah's father had already contacted the police to report her missing. This happened well before another student called the police after hearing suspicious noises. Sarah's father told authorities that he regularly spoke to his daughter on the phone, but she hadn't answered any calls in the past 24 hours, which was unlike her. Worried, he decided to report her disappearance. Although police are often slow to respond to such reports, thinking teenagers may have run off due to personal issues or just for fun, this case was different. There was a strong suspicion that Sarah could be the next victim of a violent criminal, making it critical to find her as quickly as possible. Despite Harold's success as a businessman, he was known for his kind and down-to-earth nature, easily getting along with everyone around him. He frequently participated in community events and even gave away free pizza during church services. Harold was also deeply involved in mentoring young people, which is how he met Sarah McLinn. She had started working at one of his restaurants in Topeka when she was 14 years old, taking simple orders at the counter. Her hard work didn't go unnoticed. Harold often complimented her, though. At that time, Sarah, still a teenager, chose to ignore his remarks. By the time Sarah was 17, she was desperate to move out of her parents' house. The atmosphere at home was tense, with her parents constantly arguing over the division of property after their divorce, which weighed heavily on Sarah. She began saving money by working at Harold's restaurant, but even with her part-time job, she couldn't save enough to afford her own place. During this period, her relationship with Harold grew closer. She opened up to him about her problems, and he, as part of his mentoring role, became like a second father to her. According to Sarah, her biological father had never shown her much affection. Harold was moved by Sarah's story and offered her a place to stay. He knew she had no other way out, and was desperately trying to escape the toxic environment at home. Sarah accepted his offer and soon moved in with him. However, her mother, the only close relative who expressed concern, was wary of the arrangement. She repeatedly voiced her suspicions to Sarah, keeping a close eye on her daughter's movements. But Sarah was determined. She could no longer stand living in a house filled with constant arguments and tension. After Sarah enrolled in college, she moved in with Harold, both seeing it as a temporary solution. They believed it wouldn't last long. Harold wanted to help her by covering her tuition and giving her a place to stay. Over the next few months, they developed a close friendship and became more comfortable with each other. Later, they moved together into a new house in the suburbs, continuing to grow their relationship. But by July 2014, that same house would become the scene of a horrific crime. For investigators, it was unusual for a 19-year-old girl to be living with a 52-year-old man in what was described as a friendly relationship. Initially, detectives assumed that Sarah might have been attacked, just like her mentor. Her parents were extremely worried when she didn't answer their calls, fearing she might have been abducted. If the perpetrator wasn't found quickly, Sarah's fate could be tragic. Forensic experts were shocked by the brutality of the attack on Harold. His hands were tied behind his back, and his throat was slashed. Blood analysis at the scene confirmed that it all belonged to the victim, supporting the theory that Sarah likely wasn't harmed but had been kidnapped. The house showed clear signs of a robbery. Many items were tossed out of drawers as if the intruder had been searching for valuables. They stole cash and a firearm Harold had kept for self-defense. The most puzzling detail for investigators was that nearly all of Sarah's belongings were missing from the house, packed up hastily. However, her car was still in the driveway, and her phone and tablet were left on the kitchen table. This reinforced the detectives' belief that Sarah had been abducted. She wouldn't have left her things, especially her phone and car, behind otherwise. The most mysterious clue was the blood-written letters on the floor. It seemed like some kind of message, but it was so smudged that it couldn't be read. The only other lead was Harold's missing car, which was soon captured on a toll booth camera headed toward Texas. However, the footage was too grainy to identify the driver or even determine their gender. The car was moving south, but no further information from cameras was available. A week passed, but there was no news. Sarah seemed to disappear. However, late in the evening of January 25, 2014, a patrol officer near Glace, Florida, noticed a car parked on the side of the road, parked in an inappropriate place. The officer decided to check it out and discovered a sleeping girl curled up in the back seat. There were numerous empty water bottles in the passenger compartment, indicating that she had probably been living in the car for some time. The patrolman knocked on the window and woke the girl, warning her to leave the place. As a precaution, he checked the license plate number against the database and found that the car was a wanted car belonging to Harold Sasko. The girl was immediately apprehended and sent to Kansas for further investigation. After Sarah was apprehended and the vehicle was seized, a search of the vehicle turned up several weapons, including a large knife, a handgun, and an axe. Forensic investigators determined that it was the knife that was used to take the life of 52-year-old businessman Harold, whose throat was slit. This fact made investigators wonder, what could push the girl, for whom Harold was a mentor and, to some extent, replaced her father, to such a brutal crime? During the interrogation, Sarah said that everything began after she moved in with Harold. In the beginning, their relationship did resemble a father-daughter relationship. The man took care of her, asked her to call him dad in public, and told everyone that Sarah was his stepdaughter to avoid suspicion. However, over time everything changed. Harold began to make indecent proposals to her and gradually moved on to molestation. At first, Sarah tried to avoid these conversations, but Harold became more and more insistent. The man began to demand intimacy, claiming that he had invested in her and now she had to pay back. To increase the pressure, Harold made a list of all his expenses on Sarah, including the plastic surgeries he insisted on to improve her nose and buttocks. He insisted on changes to her appearance, assuring her that it was the only way she would be perfect by his standards. He even wanted her to have her breasts enlarged. Gradually, Harold began to humiliate her, claiming that her real appearance was insufficient and that no one would love her as she was. The girl found herself morally broken. Harold began to drink alcohol and give her illegal substances, and when Sarah was under their influence, he abused her. Over time, she began to give in to his demands and without alcohol, just to avoid making him angry. This constant pressure left Sarah in a victimized state, afraid to leave him and unable to even approach her parents for fear of judgment and shame. As a result, her mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. She began to avoid work, drank frequently, and spent her days on the couch thinking about how to get out of this hopeless situation. In the end, she saw no other option but to take her own life to free herself from Harold. On that fateful day, January 14, 2014, when Harold came home and started setting up his speaker system, he asked her to bring him a beer. Sarah added some pre-purchased sleeping pills to the drink. As soon as Harold passed out, she tied his hands to keep him safe. When questioned, she admitted that it was at that moment that she felt in complete control of the situation. Sarah then grabbed a knife and without hesitation plunged it into Harold's neck, cutting his throat. In a state of madness, she tried to cut off his head. At the interrogation, the girl described in detail all the horrifying details of the crime. Despite a brief moment of hesitation, when she wanted to stop, Sarah could no longer stop her actions and decided to finish the job. The police officers were also trying to figure out some of the strange things found at the crime scene. They wanted to understand what the inscription made in blood meant and why it had been erased. The girl eventually explained that she had written the word freedom in blood after committing the crime, but it was accidentally erased. The suspect believed that this was how she was supposed to free herself, and it symbolized the purpose of her crime. After the massacre of Harold was completed, she showered and changed her clothes. On January 17, 2015, Sarah McLinn was charged with first-degree murder. The hearing was held in the District Court of the City of Lawrence. On the side of the girl were many witnesses who claimed that she had never shown any propensity for violence or cruelty. However, the prosecution had the opposite opinion. Numerous irrefutable evidences were collected against Sarah. She was found in the victim's car next to a bloody knife with the victim's blood on the blade and the girl's fingerprints on the handle. At the first interrogation, Sarah confessed to the crime and did not recant her testimony even before the start of the trial. Due to the particular brutality of the crime, The prosecutor's office intended to demand a life sentence for the defendant. Sarah's lawyer decided to use a defense strategy based on her mental state, believing that this was a more advantageous approach. He insisted that the girl was insane and in need of treatment. The defense argued that Sarah had mental health issues that she struggled with by taking prescription drugs. However, about a year before the crime, a doctor prescribed a new medication that had a devastating effect on the young student's psyche. She began to have bouts of aggression, periodically went into a rage, and suffered from obsessive thoughts. All this led to the fact that she developed a homicidal mania. For a long time, Sarah tried to cope with the effects of the medication and her disorders, hoping that they would eventually pass. Sarah was sure that once she killed someone, she wouldn't be able to stop. The idea never left her. Sometimes she thought that taking Harold's life would give her new strength, and the thought inspired her. Eventually, she became curious about what it would be like to take someone's life. However, the defense lawyer argued that the crime had been committed under the influence of emotion, impulsively, and that the defendant had been unable to cope with her sudden feelings. The prosecutor insisted that, despite her mental problems, the girl had a clear plan and was aware of her actions. This version was reinforced by the fact that Sarah had been searching for neck wounds, learning how to inflict more effective damage and finding a victim for her crime. On the eve of the crime, Harold had become depressed. He felt depressed and even contemplated taking his own life. Sarah probably decided that she could help her mentor by committing this act on his behalf. The prosecutor argued that the fact that she planned and prepared for the crime belied the defendant's insanity, and therefore she should have been punished. However, the defense also had its own arguments. Defense counsel argued that Sarah was diagnosed with multiple mental disorders, including several alter egos that arose as a consequence of dissociative identity disorder. These states emerged in her as a defense mechanism for the conditions in which she found herself. On this basis, defense counsel insisted on the girl's insanity. A psychiatrist who had worked with Sarah while awaiting trial confirmed that such disorders can develop in young people against the background of traumatic events. The prosecution concluded its case by emphasizing two incontrovertible facts. First, Harold was dead, and second, Sarah was undoubtedly the murderer. Although she tried to portray herself as a victim of circumstance, the real victim was already resting in the grave. The defense insisted that the girl had serious mental problems and had been intimately abused and molested by the murdered man. During the trial, many members of the jury wondered, how far can a person go when pressured by insanity and fear? When the jury retired for deliberations, Sarah looked more collected than ever. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw the Sasko family. The look of pain and bitterness on their faces was a real blow to her. She couldn't contain her emotions and apologized to them, though she knew that her words couldn't bring back the man she had killed. Fear gripped her when she realized that behind her actions was not only a tragedy, but also the need to take responsibility for her actions. The jury, in reaching their decision, emphasized that this was a premeditated murder, planned with cold calculation. As a result, Sarah was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years. In May 2021, Sarah's case was reviewed and her parole was reduced to 25 years, but this verdict failed to lessen the horror she had caused. Sarah is now serving time at the Topeka Correctional Facility in Topeka, Kansas, and her earliest possibility of being released is in 2039. But will she really be able to leave the prison walls if her inner world remains forever locked in the shadows of what she's done? Every day she spends incarcerated reminds her of what she has lost and what will forever be behind her. A coldness has settled in her heart that never seems to leave her, just like Harold's shadow, which she is no longer able to forget. On a November morning in 2000, the mutilated bodies of a newlywed couple were found in a quiet suburb of Dallas. The crime was so brutal that investigators had literally no doubt it was a massacre committed with cold blood and calculation. The circle of suspects was narrowed down to the cousin of one of the victims, Ivan Cantu, whose life after that turned into a never-ending nightmare. Evidence, witness statements, forensic tests. Everything seemed to scream his guilt. However, the deeper one digs into this story, the more questions arise. Why do the confessions of key witnesses seem so strained? Where did things appear in Cantu's house that, as it later turned out, could not have belonged to him at all? And most importantly, who could really have been behind the bloody murders? The final verdict came quickly: the death penalty. But even years later, Cantu was desperate to prove his innocence, despite the impending lethal injection. And when everyone had already accepted his fate, the unexpected intervention of a documentary filmmaker shook up the case, forcing a fresh look at the tragedy. What if the true culprit had remained at large all this time? What if, in the pursuit of justice, the system has been on the wrong track? There are more mysteries to this case than meets the eye. And the closer you get to the solution, the more clearly you feel the icy breath of inevitable tragedy. On January 23, 2001, Yvonne Kant was charged with double murder. According to state law, such a crime inevitably carries the death penalty. On October 3rd of the same year, the trial began, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was heated to the max. The prosecution confidently relied on the testimony of Ivan's ex-girlfriend, Amy Butcher, and her brother Jeff, who claimed that the motive for the crime was a desire for revenge for the dismissal and the desire to seize the money and jewelry of his brother James. According to them, Ivan acted cold-bloodedly and calculatingly, planning every move. To support its case, the prosecution presented 34 witnesses, including experts from various fields of forensic science. The centerpiece of the case were the confessions of Amy and Jeff, whose testimony sounded like a pre-rehearsed play. Their details were frighteningly accurate, creating an image of Ivan as a ruthless criminal. However, Ivan's defense looked, to put it mildly, unconvincing. The lawyers did not present a single witness in his favor. And what is striking, the defense actually agreed with the prosecution, admitting Ivan's guilt. Allegedly, he attacked his cousin and killed his fiancée only because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, Ivan categorically denied his involvement. His eyes shone with a desperate determination to prove his innocence. He begged the court to allow him to testify as a witness, hoping for a chance to tell his truth, but was denied. The jury, in no uncertain terms, unanimously found him guilty, and the death sentence was passed. But Ivan's story did not end there. He was not going to wait obediently for his fate behind bars. His will to live and his desire to clear his name were adamant. Contrary to expectations, the execution was postponed twice, in 2004 and 2006, and in 2009, the appeals court finally confirmed the death sentence. Not giving up hope, Ivan filed a request for an independent forensic examination. He insisted on analyzing skin particles from under the victim's fingernails, arguing that this could shed light on who the perpetrator really was. He also demanded a re-examination of the car that had been found in the parking lot outside his apartment, assuring that the car could have left prints or footprints of the real perpetrator. But time was passing, and it seemed that the truth might have been buried with Ivan. Was he the victim of a monstrous mistake or a cold-blooded killer? The answer to this question still remains open. The story of Ivan Cantu is full of contradictions and mysteries. The questions that arose during the investigation remained unanswered. Was he really a cold-blooded criminal, or was he the victim of a miscarriage of justice? Many details still seem mysterious, and the motives for the crime blurred. To understand what really happened, one must go back to the beginning of this tragedy, to the fateful day that forever changed the lives of two young people whose names were forgotten behind the loud accusations. Ivan was supported not only by his loved ones, but also by influential figures, politicians, activists, and celebrities. Among those who publicly spoke in his defense were such celebrities as Jane Fonda, Martin Sheen, and Kim Kardashian. They called for a review of the case, pointing out its possible errors and the unfairness of the verdict. However, despite the loud statements and protests, Ivan's situation remained critical. His last hope was a pardon from the governor, but even that prospect seemed almost fantastic. Such cases were extremely rare in Texas. Pardons had been granted only 3 times in the past 50 years. With each new reprieve, it seemed that the chance of salvation was becoming more and more elusive. The question was urgent. Could someone break this deadly game? Or would Ivan remain just another victim of a system in which the truth was too often drowned in the intricacies of judicial intrigue and human prejudice? What really happened on that fateful day? How do these events relate to Ivan Cantu, and could he have been the one who committed this terrible crime? To make sense of it, we will have to delve into the details of the tragedy, which is still controversial and makes us doubt the obvious. Ivan Cantu, born June 14, 1973 in Dallas, grew up in a well-to-do family where he had no lack of material wealth. His childhood was peaceful, with his parents ensuring his education in the best schools. However, despite the support, after completing high school, Ivan saw no point in continuing his studies at a college or university. His goal was to find a prestigious job as soon as possible and support himself independently. His parents, of course, insisted on higher education, but Ivan was adamant. At the age of 20, Ivan hit the road with a musical group, acting as a sideman. He traveled around the country, enjoying the success and monetary rewards that touring brought. Soon, however, the routine life on wheels began to weigh on him, and Ivan decided to change course. Shifting his attention to the real estate market, he soon achieved impressive results. Working as a mortgage broker, he began earning six-figure sums and seemed to have found his calling. Despite his achievements, his life was not cloudless. The young and successful Ivan found himself ensnared in luxury and prosperity. His new life in a luxurious house with a new wife was studded with expensive cars and abundance. However, behind the facade of prosperity hid a dark side. Alcohol and illicit substances were slowly destroying him, making him unpredictable and violent. His wife soon discovered that Ivan had ties to criminal circles and began to suspect him of trafficking in illegal substances. These suspicions and a strained relationship led to their separation, which was the beginning of his downfall. After the breakup with his wife, Ivan found himself on the edge of the abyss. His career collapsed, his property was lost, and his addiction only aggravated his situation. Looking for a way out of the crisis, he enlisted in the Navy, hoping for a new beginning. But the harsh army life did not meet his expectations, and soon Ivan returned to civilian life, still in search of stability. His only way out was to return to his cousin James, who offered him temporary housing. Amy Kitchen and Jason Mosqueda were a couple who dreamed of a happy life and made plans for the future. Their fates crossed with Ivan, and this intersection became fatal. Cheerful and full of hope, they were drawn into a tragedy that changed everything. How could an ordinary conflict turn into such a nightmare? What really bonded Ivan to Amy and Jason? On December 2, 1977, Amy Michelle Kitchen was born in Tarrant County, Texas. She was the youngest child in a family where her older brother Mark was already growing up. The only daughter in the family, she was surrounded by special attention and care from childhood. Her parents could not deny her anything and often spoiled her. Nevertheless, Emmy retained a warmth of heart and kindness. She was described as a friendly, responsible, and cheerful girl who was always eager to help others, despite her privileged position. After graduating from high school in 1996, Emmy decided to connect her life with medicine and went to university, choosing a faculty that matched her desire to help people. Her dream was not just to become a doctor, but to create something of her own, a clinic where patients would feel protected and understood. To do so, she moved to Denton County, closer to the university, ready to begin a new chapter of her life. It was during this period that Emmy met James Makita. Their acquaintance occurred at a party organized by mutual friends. Mutual sympathy quickly developed into a relationship. James was a native of Mexico who was born in 1973. He spent his childhood in his native country, but then moved to the United States, where he graduated from high school. Outwardly, he looked closed and a bit wordy, but this did not prevent him from being successful in business. James was engaged in mortgage activities and quickly enough opened his own agency. Despite his reticence, James was a family man, especially warm to his nephews, with whom he spent a lot of time playing video games and attending sporting events. Their relationship was dynamic, but this apparent harmony hid details that were not obvious to outsiders. Meeting James brought not only romance into Emmy's life, but also unexpected difficulties that ended up having a serious impact on her destiny. At first, it seemed that Emmy and James were two completely different universes colliding in a chaotic dance of fate. While Emmy was the soul of the company, whose charm attracted everyone around her, James remained an enigma, immersed in his own thoughts and secrets. But this apparent contrast only served to intensify their attraction. The spark of sympathy that arose between them quickly grew into a passionate and strong relationship. Gradually, they became inseparable, spending every spare moment together. Their families watched with satisfaction as the couple, despite their differences, found harmony and happiness in each other. By 1998, James had achieved significant success in his business, which allowed him to realize ambitious plans to purchase a luxurious home in the northern suburbs of Dallas. The move to the new home, made 2 years after their relationship began, symbolized a new phase in their lives. Although they were not yet officially married, the move was a sign of their serious intentions. Emmy was consumed with dreams of a lavish wedding. She envisioned a grand gala day filled with beauty and joy, followed by a cozy family hearth. She planned to devote herself to starting a family, having children and raising them, while James would continue to run his successful business. Against the backdrop of their stable financial situation and seeming prosperity, their lives seemed almost perfect. But beneath the layer of prosperity lurked dark corners that no one could have predicted. With each passing day, their relationship deepened, and it became increasingly clear that behind the beautiful facade of family life could be hidden cracks that could destroy their harmony. The shadows of the past and the uncharted depths of their souls were ready to spill out, and their ideal life soon began to show troubling portents that heralded tragic changes. Emmy and James's lives changed dramatically when Ivan Cantu came into their lives. This is the same young man who was James's cousin, and at the moment, he was struggling financially and struggling with problems in his personal life. Now he was in the right place at the right time. James, showing generosity and compassion, decided to offer Ivan a job at his mortgage agency in Dallas and allowed him to temporarily move into his home. At the time, Ivan was 26 years old and looking for a way out of a predicament that had proved insurmountable. Initially, their relationship seemed to be restored. They became close brothers again. However, the idyll was short-lived. In 2000, suddenly and without explanation, James kicked Ivan out of the house and fired him from his job. The reason, according to rumors, were suspicions about Ivan's connections with criminal circles. Despite this abrupt turnaround, the two managed to maintain a peaceful relationship, and it seemed that resentment was not a thing of the past. At this time, James and Emmy, full of happiness and love, were preparing for their wedding. James, 27, and his 22-year-old bride dreamed of a romantic vacation in the Bahamas. Upon returning from that trip, James presented Emmy with a sparkling diamond ring, which further strengthened their resolve to create a future together. Ivan, trying to start a new life, moved to Minnesota. Here he took a job with a mortgage company and worked part-time at a local restaurant. At this establishment, he met 23-year-old Emmy Butcher and her 21-year-old brother Jeff. A relationship began between Ivan and Emmy, which quickly developed. 2 months later, the couple decided to move to Dallas, near the home of James and Emmy Kitchen, who had already returned from their trip and were consumed with wedding preparations. But, as is so often the case in life, the clouds began to gather over this bright moment. Fate was preparing its trials, and soon all that seemed serene and harmonious was doomed to destruction. The changes that began with personal conflicts and personal tragedies would soon come crashing down on every aspect of their lives, leaving only consequences and shattered dreams. On November 3, 2000, on an evening that seemed simple and peaceful, James and Emmy went to dinner with Emmy's father. The awe-inspiring conversation about their future, careers, and plans to start a family was filled with laughter and joy. No one could have imagined that this dinner would be their last moment together. At about 10:30 p.m., satisfied with the warm atmosphere of the meeting, all three of them went home, planning to repeat this pleasant tradition soon. That evening did not portend any trouble. However, around 11 p.m. that evening, Emmy called her mother, informing her of an important meeting for the next day. However, she never showed up for the scheduled meeting. The next morning, her mother, feeling increasingly anxious, attempted to contact her daughter several times, but without success. Emmy usually always called back if she couldn't answer right away. But this time, the silence had lasted for hours. It was unusual and alarming. The situation became even more alarming when James, with whom Emmy had always kept in constant contact, also stopped contacting. The panic-stricken parents learned that James's relatives couldn't contact him either. All signs indicated that something extremely serious had happened. Shocked and worried, they went to the house where the newlyweds lived, but no one answered their knock on the door. James's car was parked in place, indicating his presence in the house. Soon, Emmy's mother contacted emergency services. Around 5:30 p.m., police arrived on the scene. Opening the door and entering the home revealed that the parents' fears were realized. The bodies of James and Emmy were discovered in the bedroom. James was lying on the bed, face up, and Emmy was on the floor, face down. Both had suffered fatal gunshot wounds. Police quickly determined that the deaths had occurred hours earlier, as the bodies showed obvious signs of rigor mortis. This tragedy came as a shock to all who knew the young couple. A quiet evening of dinner turned into a tragedy, leaving behind only questions and endless grief. When investigators arrived on the scene, they immediately noticed several disturbing details. The lack of signs of struggle and forced entry raised questions, especially since the door had already been broken into after police arrived on the scene. Relatives of the victims, who were the first to discover the tragedy, did not notice anything suspicious until law enforcement arrived. However, valuables were missing from the house, creating disturbing speculation about possible motives for the crime. The disappearance of Emmy's black Chevrolet Corvette convertible, James's expensive watch, and the diamond engagement ring given during their romantic trip left no doubt that the crime had a self-serving motive. These items, which totaled thousands of dollars in value, were clear signs that the perpetrator may have had a profit motive. The loved ones of the victims, shaken by the tragedy, could not understand who could have committed such a brutal crime. James and Emmy were known as honest and decent people who made plans for the future and had no criminal connections or addictions. Their lives were filled with dreams of family and career accomplishments. They were not known in a circle of people with whom they might have had conflicts, which only added to the misunderstanding of the motives for the crime. One of the detectives suggested that the perpetrator was probably from the victim's inner circle. He may have known them, had access to their home, or been let in by the owners themselves. The motive could have been old grudges or jealousy. The possibility of a random robbery cannot be ruled out, as the missing items were of considerable value. The perpetrator may have come for revenge and, having found opportunities for theft, took advantage of the situation. The investigation was faced with many versions and suspicions, but each of them opened a new facet of the tragedy. Soon began a complex and hard work to solve this brutal crime. Every piece of information was important and could be a clue. The investigation had to make sense of the complex web of versions and evidence left behind after the tragedy. An autopsy on James's body revealed that he had received a single aimed shot to the head, which instantly led to his death. Emmy's body, on the other hand, was struck by 4 bullets. Apparently, after the first shot, when she probably tried to run away, she was caught up on the floor next to the bed and was mercilessly shot. This evidence conclusively established that gunshot wounds were the cause of their deaths. No crime weapon was found at the scene, and no apparent suspects were identified. However, investigators' attention was soon drawn to information about Ivan Cantu's recent firing, provided by Emmy Kitchen's relatives. This news could have linked Ivan to the incident, especially since the couple had no obvious enemies. Ivan's caring mother, Sylvia, contacted the police a few hours after learning of the tragedy. The woman reported that she had been unable to get into her son's apartment and had noticed a bullet-like hole in the wall. She was deeply concerned because Ivan and his fiancée were on the road visiting her parents in Arkansas. Sylvia was terrified that her son might have encountered the same evil that James and Emmy had died. Detectives immediately went to the scene and found Emmy Kitchen's car parked next to the apartment complex. This circumstance suspiciously linked Ivan to the murder. A search warrant was soon obtained for Ivan's apartment. During the search, a bunch of keys to his cousin's house were found, as well as pants, shoes, and socks discarded in the kitchen trash can. These items had traces that looked suspiciously like blood, further complicating the situation. In addition, a box of ammunition was found in the apartment. While investigators continued to sort through the evidence, Ivan was in Arkansas. His mother was finally able to contact him and shared her concerns about the bullet hole in the wall. Despite the seriousness of what was happening, Ivan discussed these events with friends and remained remarkably calm, despite being aware of the police searches. Thus, the situation became more and more tense and confusing. Versions multiplied, and each new fact only added to the complex puzzle that the investigation had to solve. Ivan Cantu tried to justify himself by claiming that his life had become a nightmare after a man dressed as a pizza delivery man came to his house on November 2nd, a pizza he had not ordered. This uninvited guest, as it soon turned out, was an underworld acquaintance who demanded payment from Ivan for illegal drugs. Ivan sensed something wrong and, without opening the door, left it on a chain. Soon the conflict between them escalated, and the visitor, threatening serious consequences, promised more drastic measures if the debt was not repaid. 4 days later, on November 7th, the same man returned and shot at the wall of Ivan's apartment to intimidate the debtor. After that, Ivan and his girlfriend, Amy Butcher, made the decision to leave town. After searching Ivan's apartment, when he and Amy returned to Dallas, they were stopped by police officers and taken to the station. The police, based on the evidence they had gathered, believed Ivan was responsible for the double murder. A .380 caliber semi-automatic pistol, which he always carried with him, was found at his cousin's house, where Ivan had lived for some time. This fact only added to the suspicion that he was involved in the crime. Ivan, despite everything, continued to insist on his innocence, claiming that the murders were the work of a criminal partner who was dissatisfied with Ivan's failure to pay him back. According to him, the man was trying to intimidate him into repaying his debt and soon began threatening him. However, investigators were puzzled by the question: why would the perpetrator want to kill Ivan's relatives and leave him himself alive? This aspect of the story seemed illogical and created doubts about the plausibility of Ivan's version. Further investigation revealed that Ivan's alleged criminal partner did have connections to the underworld and could have been a victim of a rival group. The man, dressed as a pizza delivery man, turned out to be a trafficker of illegal drugs whose business had crossed paths with Ivan. The trafficker, when detained, admitted his connection to crime, but did not report his actions immediately, fearing imprisonment for his illegal activities. His detention and lies only increased the investigation's suspicion of Ivan's guilt, emphasizing that the investigation was becoming increasingly convoluted and tense. The investigation escalated after a new hypothesis became known that the real culprit could have been another person. However, this hypothesis was quickly debunked by Amy Butcher. In a shocking confession made by the girl, she confirmed that her boyfriend, Ivan Cantu, confessed to her about the crime. According to her, this confession took place on the night of November 3rd, shortly after Ivan returned from the scene of the crime. Ivan told Emmy that he had traveled by car, relying on revenge against James. In his version, James had allegedly stolen several $1,000s from him and the illegal substances he was dealing. When Ivan returned home, he was bloody and his face was swollen, and his clothes were covered with suspicious red stains. At Emmy's direction, he threw the clothes into a bucket under the sink. The girl also noticed an expensive watch in Ivan's possession that matched the one missing from the victims. By the time Ivan returned to Dallas, he had asked Emmy to marry him and gave her a diamond ring, the exact same one that had gone missing from James's fiancée. Emmy was unable to provide the ring for analysis, as Ivan took it away shortly after their return. This ring likely represented important evidence that Ivan attempted to destroy, but his actions only added to the evidence against him. Jeff Butcher, Emmy's brother, also confirmed Ivan's confession. He told police that on the day of the crime, Ivan had personally told him about the crime and offered a cash reward for his help in cleaning up the crime scene. Jeff, afraid of becoming an accomplice, declined the offer. Investigators found a bunch of keys in Ivan's apartment that matched the locks in the victim's home. Ivan's fingerprints were found at the scene. Clothing found in a trash can in the kitchen was tested and was found to have traces of blood on them that matched the victim's DNA. The final blow to Ivan's version of events was struck by ballistics analysis. The gun found in James's home was used in the crime. The bullets recovered from the victims' bodies matched those found in Ivan's apartment. The characteristic marks on the bullets confirmed that the weapon used in the crime was unique, which finally tied Ivan to the crime scene. In the turmoil of the trials, covered in the pages of newspapers and on the evening news, on January 23, 2001,
Ivan Cantu found himself in the spotlight as a double murder defendant. Texas state law was ruthless. Such a crime implied the inevitability of the death penalty. Already on October 3rd of that year, the trial began and attracted public and media attention. The prosecution team presented the testimony of Amy Butcher and her brother Jeff, who accused Ivan of a brutal crime, motivated by revenge for dismissal and lust for gain, money and jewelry. The prosecution brought in 34 witnesses, including forensic experts, to support its case. At the heart of the case were the confessions of Amy and Jeff, which formed a clear picture of the crime. Ivan Cantu insisted that his ex-fiancee's testimony was unreliable because of her dependence on illegal substances. He argued that at the time of the interrogation, she was under the influence of illegal drugs and did not realize what she was saying. However, these arguments were rejected by the court, and the investigators said that the material collected for the examination was insufficient. In their opinion, this indicated that there was no struggle. The victims were killed, lightning fast, without even having time to try to defend themselves. In addition, the car found at the scene of the crime had been thoroughly cleaned, which made it difficult to identify the traces. Despite Ivan's best efforts to get justice, his efforts seemed futile. The prosecutor's office would not reconsider the case, and Ivan himself continued to fight desperately for his release. His mother, Sylvia, never gave up hope and believed that her son could not be a criminal. His mother's support and loyalty to his cause became his only light in the tunnel. However, the turning point came in 2019 when television producer Matt Duff, who specializes in controversial death penalty cases, stumbled upon Ivan's story. Inspired by the story and his sense of injustice, he decided to dive into the details of the case. Matt was convinced that Ivan may have been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. After realizing that his journalistic experience was not enough for an in-depth investigation, he decided to get his private investigator's license to uncover the truth and provide a new perspective on a complex and mysterious case. Matt Duff's training in private detective investigation was his key to solving a case that had long remained in the shadows. Upon completion of the course, he broke standard confidentiality rules and began publicly covering the Ivan Cantu case through his podcast. Despite the lack of official hiring by Ivan's family or his attorneys, Matt decided that the truth deserved to be publicized. He funded his own investigation, driven by a desire to uncover the hidden aspects of the case. Not aiming to simply secure Ivan's release, Matt focused on finding the truth. He traveled frequently to Texas, interviewing witnesses and enlisting a former Dallas police officer to help him find Amy Butcher. The woman was an important figure, and her testimony could play a key role in solving the case. After many attempts, Matt managed to find Amy. Her testimony remained much the same as before, but new evidence had come to light that cast doubt on its credibility. Matt also noticed that Ivan's defense attorney was not doing a good job, which was also criticized. By 2020, Matt Duff analyzed 50 hours of interrogation notes and forensic materials reviewed by independent experts. He found that the materials clearly pointed to Ivan's possible non-involvement in the crime. He was particularly alarmed by the discovery of clothes and shoes in the trash garbage can of Ivan's apartment. The dimensions of the items did not match his own. However, it was still unclear how these items had ended up in Ivan's apartment and what this could mean for the case. The Rolex watches listed among the missing items were only found many years later in the victim's home. They were identified by a unique name engraving. There were also questions about a diamond ring that was given to James's fiancée on the day of their deaths. Witnesses claimed that she had been wearing the ring even before the crime, casting doubt on the claims of it being in Ivan Cantu's possession. Matt Duff continued the investigation, discovering that key prosecution witnesses were under the influence of illegal substances at the time of their testimony. These new circumstances, while significant, were not decisive in court. Nevertheless, the producer did not give up. He created a public outcry, gathering activists from Texas who supported the version of Ivan's innocence. Among the supporters were even representatives of the Catholic Church who saw injustice in the case. Under the influence of public pressure, a petition was organized, which collected 80,000 signatures sent to the chief prosecutor of the state. Matt Duff was able to convince some of the former supporters of the prosecution that there may have been a miscarriage of justice. As a result,
there was real hope for a review of Ivan Cantu's case and his eventual release. On April 26, 2023, the time was set for a new trial. A few days before the hearing, Ivan reasserted his innocence, arguing that he could not accept death for a crime he had not committed. In an interview, he spoke of the fear that has haunted him for 22 years. The fear that his life could be ended by lethal injection before he could prove his innocence. Ivan continued to insist that the investigation of his case was far from fair. He claimed that the law enforcement agencies ignored any version other than the one in which he was the perpetrator. Despite his complicated history with the criminal world, which nearly took his life, Ivan assured that he had not committed a crime that could justify the death penalty. Allegations made by his former girlfriend, Emmy Butcher, were also the subject of his anger. Ivan claimed that Emmy was motivated by revenge and that her testimony was nothing more than malicious slander. Sadly, Emmy passed away in 2021, leaving her words an unsolved mystery, adding further gravity to this confusing case. The investigation soon uncovered many irregularities. Evidence was fitted to an already cooked result, and the dates of the crimes turned out to be incorrect. In fact, the murders were committed on the morning of November 4, 2000, while Ivan was in Arkansas with his girlfriend, which completely disproved the allegations against him. By 2022, the situation had become even more complicated. Emmy Butcher's brother, Jeff, unexpectedly recanted his testimony, giving Ivan's defenders a new trump card in the fight for justice. However, despite their best efforts and carefully prepared evidence, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied the request for a retrial. Much evidence went unreviewed and the death sentence was upheld. A new execution date was set for February 28, 2024, but this too had to be postponed, leaving Ivan in a state of uncertainty and fear for his future. On that grim day, just hours after his lawyer failed to get through to the authorities with final requests for a review of the case, Ivan was sent to his death. His mother, Sylvia, in desperation, gathered a group of friends and activists outside the prison, where protesters, holding placards and chanting slogans, tried desperately to draw attention to the case. But their efforts proved futile, and their appeals went unanswered. In his last words, Ivan again insisted on his innocence. He addressed the families of the victims, stating that despite all the conflicts, he could not be responsible for the death of his cousin and his fiancée. He expressed his love for them, even in such difficult times, and argued that his conflicting feelings could not be the cause of such a horrible crime. Ivan devoted his last moments before his execution to thanking those who had fought for his cause, even though justice had not been served. In that tragic moment, he left behind not only the memory of his struggle, but also the silent questions about justice and human destiny that would plague his cause and those who believed in it. Ivan Cantu was eventually executed in Texas on February 28, 2024, becoming the first inmate executed that year. Sometimes kindness becomes a fatal mistake. No one expects that behind a sincere desire to preserve the family, restore relations, or simply support a loved one, something dark and destructive can hide. Paul has always been a good father and a faithful husband, ready to turn a blind eye to all the wrongs for the sake of their children to grow up in a complete family. He believed to the last that he could save their marriage, that his love was stronger than lies and betrayal. But that fateful night, his kindness turned into a death trap for him. When Jacqueline invited him to the bar, he didn't suspect a trick. Her smile seemed warm, and her offer to have a drink together a chance for reconciliation. He didn't know that this evening would be his last, that her every gesture hid a cold calculation. A few hours later, Paul could barely stand on his feet, and an hour later he was gone. The house that had always been his refuge had become an arena for a brutal massacre, and those he trusted most were his executioners. Death came to him from the man closest to him, the man he swore his love to, fought for, and who did not hesitate to take his life for a measly insurance policy. On May 17, 2007, the court found Roger and Jackie guilty of murder, and Colin Robinson guilty of accessory after the fact. Roger's mother, Dawn Ferguson, also did not escape punishment. She was accused of trying to confuse the investigation by giving her son a false alibi. The prosecution argued that Roger had lied in an attempt to portray himself as a victim of Jackie's manipulation. However, The prosecution was certain. The two of them had carefully planned the crime to obtain insurance, staging it as a failed robbery just to get the money. The trial was over, and it seemed that the truth had been revealed. However, to understand how it all happened, you have to go back and find out what led to these decisions. Detectives scrutinized the phone records, focusing on the conversations with Roger. The man's confiscated cell phone revealed important details. He was communicating with 17-year-old Colin Robinson. On the night of the massacre, at 2:21, Colin made a call that immediately caught the attention of investigators. The young man admitted to being at the house, but had originally planned to drive a car that belonged to the killer. During the interrogation, Colin could not stand it and admitted that he had lied. He revealed that he had been helping his buddy dispose of the body. According to him, when he saw that Roger was going to kill Paul, he got scared and ran away from the house, getting into his car. Later, Roger called him and offered to get into the car. When Colin opened the door, he discovered Paul's body in the back seat. The young man tried to run away, but Roger intimidated him and forced him to stay. As a result, they drove the car into an alley together and left it there. The trial that followed lasted 4 months. The evidence and confessions collected led to a trial. But what happened the night it all began? Let's move to the moment when the horrific events were just beginning to unfold. On the eve of the tragedy, Jackie decided to move the children to her paternal grandmother's house and invited her husband over for drinks and socializing. Her spouse, hoping it would help mend their relationship and stay connected to the children, readily accepted the offer. This was unexpected for Jackie, who usually avoided socializing with her husband and preferred to spend time alone or in the company of other men. That evening, she took her husband to the pub and insisted that he drink more, almost forcing him to do so. By nightfall, he was barely on his feet. The bar's CCTV cameras captured the moment they left the establishment at around 1:23 a.m. and went home. After that, the man was never seen alive again. The call to emergency services came in at around 2:35 a.m., and the journey home took approximately 5 minutes. The time lapse of over an hour raised suspicions among investigators, who began to suspect that Jackie may have purposely gotten her husband drunk so that he would not be able to resist the attack. While examining the scene, detectives found several inconsistencies in Jackie's story. A cell phone was found on the nightstand with the screen upside down, contradicting her claim that she was dialing emergency services. It was impossible to dial a number with that screen upside down. Moreover, officers found Jacqueline with her hands tied, but not her legs. She claimed that the intruders attacked her husband, beat him unconscious, and then strangled him with a plastic bag, placing it over his head and tying it around his neck with duct tape. She also mentioned that she vomited out of terror, but no traces of vomit were found at the scene. The doctor who examined the victim noted no change in her pulse and blood pressure, which seems strange for such a shocking event. Forensic experts found a shoe print in the hallway of the house that matched the size of Roger Ferguson's shoe. In the urn was found a cigarette with the DNA of the lover, and on the cable ties, which were tied to the victim, also found traces of Roger's DNA. The bag used to strangle Paul had traces of his DNA on it. No other traces were found. In the end, it turns out the widow's story was a lie. As time passes, it becomes clear that the events were not random, but what exactly led to the decision to massacre. Let's move on to analyze what happened before the crime, when everything seemed still normal. Jacqueline, or as her close friends and family called her, Jackie, met Paul Krimble when she was 17 years old. They were both high school seniors getting ready to graduate. It was obvious from the beginning that they were complete opposites. Jackie was bold, outspoken, and energetic, even feisty, causing constant problems for her parents. Paul, on the other hand, was reserved and shy. For him, Jackie was his first serious romantic infatuation, and their relationship began despite their differences. They were so different that they sometimes seemed completely incompatible. Jackie was known for being abrupt and impetuous. Her words could be harsh, while Paul remained polite and humble, always smoothing over sharp edges. His ability to respond calmly to her outbursts characteristically stood out and even looked comical at times. When the time came for Paul to meet Jackie's parents, the event came as quite a shock. Jacqueline's parents were used to her temperamental boyfriends, and they expected new problems. but Paul surprised them with his kindness and warmth. Unlike his rambunctious daughter, he seemed like the perfect young man to start a family. Jacqueline's family quickly became attached to Paul, and sometimes it seemed that they looked forward to visiting him even more than Jackie herself. A few months into the relationship, Jacqueline became pregnant. Paul, who had grown up in a religious family and held traditional views, was a committed Christian. Upon learning that he would become a father, he felt a great sense of duty and decided to devote himself to raising the child. The future father was determined to support his girlfriend and actively discussed how he would raise his children. In 1992, the couple decided to get married, and Paul proposed to Jacqueline. He was not going to leave her alone with the child and always strived to be an ideal father. On the eve of the wedding, during the bachelor party, Paul decided to have a frank talk with one of his close friends. He confessed that he did not feel real love for Jackie and realized that their characters and outlook on life were too different. The friend tried to talk him out of the marriage, but Paul couldn't go against his religious beliefs. He knew that Jacqueline was pregnant with his child and felt a moral obligation to marry for the sake of the child. Paul tried to convince himself that their feelings would grow stronger over time, hoping, like many young people, that marriage and children could bring them closer together. 6 years after they exchanged vows, Paul and Jackie had their second child. Consequently, they decided to move to a larger residence. Their financial situation improved and they purchased a townhouse in Richland. Paul, who worked as a mechanical engineer, earned a good income while Jacqueline took care of the house and children. She tried to find work from time to time, but her attempts were often unsuccessful. From the outside, their lives may have seemed prosperous, but it was during this period that the cracks in their relationship began to show. Family acquaintances noticed that Jackie would often leave Paul with the children, visiting the local bar herself. When someone who knew her made remarks to her, she reacted in a hostile and aggressive manner. This behavior was typical of Jacqueline, who held the entire family in fear and caused everyone around her a sense of constant wariness. In the small town where they lived, Jackie's rambunctious lifestyle had a negative impact on the reputation of the entire family. Gradually, she gained a reputation as a promiscuous woman, and the more conservative residents called her a promiscuous woman. Even bar workers disliked her presence because of the frequent conflicts she was involved in. Problems also arose in family life, where her brash and aggressive behavior caused tension. The children later recalled that dealing with their mother was like being constantly on the edge of a precipice. Jacqueline's aggression could erupt from even the most innocent of questions. Over time, her children became afraid of their own mother, and Paul also clearly felt uncomfortable in her presence, sometimes appearing to be afraid of her. Eventually, this strained relationship led to a terrible tragedy. In the early morning hours of Sunday, June 20th, 2004, an alarming call came into the emergency services. On the line was Jacqueline, who claimed that she and her spouse had been attacked by unknown assailants. She said that a group of intruders had broken into their home. According to her, she was tied up, and her husband was severely beaten and taken to an unknown destination. This happened just after the couple returned from a party at a bar. Fortunately, the children were at Paul's parents' house, as the couple decided to spend the evening alone. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Jacqueline, who looked alive and unharmed. Outwardly, she appeared to be partially free of her restraints. Her legs were free, but her hands were still bound with plastic ties. The police officer cut the ties with a knife. Jacqueline reported that she and Paul were attacked by 3 unknown men when they tried to take cover in the house, but did not make it in time. The intruders went inside, threatening with guns and demanding money and illegal substances. Paul, known for his good judgment, tried to negotiate, but they did not listen to him, tied them both up, and began beating them. After that, they strangled Paul with a plastic bag. Once they were satisfied that there was nothing of value in the house, they took the car keys and drove away, taking Paul with them. Jacqueline hoped her husband was still alive, but also feared that the police might not have enough time. Panicked and alone, she dialed the emergency number, using her tongue to press numbers. Police officers immediately put out a BOLO for the family's vehicle, and investigators tried to get a more detailed description of the perpetrators from Jacqueline. However, she said the attackers' faces were concealed by masks, and she could not provide any descriptive details. Nevertheless, the development of events was rapid. The very next morning, just 3 kilometers from their home, the couple's abandoned car was found in an alley. Inside the car, police officers found the body of Paul, a 35-year-old man who had been the victim of brutal beatings. His limbs were bound with cable ties, and the condition of his body indicated possible torture. The car with the body was sent to a laboratory for thorough analysis. Initially, Jacqueline's version was accepted without much doubt. However, after analyzing the evidence and talking to family, friends, and acquaintances who described Jacqueline's difficult character, she quickly became the prime suspect in the crime. The reason for this was her aggressive behavior in and outside of the family circle. The situation became more complicated when it was discovered that Jacqueline had an extramarital affair with Roger Ferguson, a 31-year-old local farmer. The fact that Jacqueline was secretly dating Roger was known to virtually everyone in the neighborhood. The relationship began to develop shortly after the young family moved into their new home. The more the police delved into the details of the victim's family life and Jacqueline's romantic relationships on the side, the clearer the motive for the murder became. The attack by a group of armed men described by Jacqueline looked like a movie plot, especially for such a quiet and peaceful community. In addition, none of the locals had seen anything to corroborate her account of the thugs, making her story highly dubious. With suspicions growing about Jacqueline, investigators discovered that the marriage was on the verge of collapse. Paul had a life insurance policy worth £300,000. Financial motives often play a key role in such crimes, and investigators were quick to point out that before her husband's death, Jacqueline had repeatedly raised questions about money. Several witnesses confirmed that she was interested in the possibilities of insurance payouts. These suspicions were also confirmed in her social media correspondence. Particular attention was drawn to Jacqueline's claims
that she was able to dial the emergency number in language. To verify this, her cell phone was sent for forensic analysis, so that forensic scientists could determine whether her saliva residue was left on the touchpad. Lab analysis confirmed what she said, but by this point, new evidence had emerged. A few days after Paul's death, Jacqueline was called back in for questioning. She continued to deny her involvement in the crime and insisted that it was the work of a gang. As there was insufficient evidence at the time, she was not charged, and after talking to the police, she was released and allowed to attend her husband's funeral. At the funeral, Jacqueline showed deep sorrow, but Paul's close friends thought her displays were fake. At this time, detectives began investigating Jacqueline's lover, Roger Ferguson, to confirm or deny their suspicions of his involvement in the crime. The police were convinced that the widow and her lover may have been involved in Paul's death, but this required hard evidence. There were no witnesses to the attack and kidnapping. Roger had an alibi, corroborated by his mother, who claimed her son had been home all night and interacted with him around 2 a.m., when he got up for a drink of water. Nevertheless, Jacqueline's lover was in no hurry to be ruled out as a suspect, and it was soon confirmed. Since clear evidence was lacking, investigators turned to the cell phone data of both suspects. This data showed that after Paul's death, Jacqueline and Roger continued to maintain a relationship. Locals often saw them together at the pub where they first met a year before Paul's death. Many visitors to the establishment described Jacqueline as irascible and prone to conflict. She socialized brashly, especially in Roger's company. Even before her husband's death, Jacqueline was not shy about showing off her wealth, often boasting that Paul was a wealthy man and considering herself the full mistress of his property. After meeting Roger, the couple often visited the billiard club, but not all of Roger's friends approved of her presence. Most advised him to stay away from Jacqueline, but Roger continued his relationship with her despite the warnings. Studying the lovers' correspondence, investigators discovered that a few days before Paul's death, Jacqueline had planned to buy a new SUV worth £23,000 for Roger. Remarkably, even Roger's mother was present at the car dealership, confirming the seriousness of their relationship. During interrogations, Jacqueline claimed that she remained faithful to her husband and had no extramarital affairs, but her false statements became commonplace for police officers. Jacqueline did not have enough money to buy a car and could not get it from her husband. Nevertheless, her plans for the expensive purchase indicated that the widow was already beginning to think about how to spend the insurance payments, even before Paul's death. Jacqueline took a job at a nursing home. This decision indicated her plans to rebuild her life, probably with the intention of starting a new chapter after separating from her husband.
Police speculated that Paul may have begun to suspect something amiss because of his wife's changed behavior. Her temper and frequent conflicts could have caused serious strain in their relationship. Neighbors noted that Jacqueline often left the house and returned late at night, and after meeting Roger, her absences became more frequent and longer. She justified her absences by saying that she was working, but Paul never saw proof of her employment, such as money or pay slips. Jacqueline did break even with occasional earnings, but she couldn't hold down one job for more than a few weeks. From her first days at her new job, Jacqueline exhibited defiant behavior and often lied to her supervisors. She also continued to deceive her husband, making up stories, such as about her children supposedly being in an accident, to justify her tardiness and absences.
One day, when Jacqueline's co-workers called home to inquire about the children's well-being, Paul was surprised to learn that everything was fine. He then discovered that her stories were lies created to cover up her frequent absences. These events only heightened Paul's suspicions. He received confirmation that Jacqueline was spending time away from home and probably with a lover. Despite this,
Paul decided to continue his relationship with his wife because he did not want a divorce and wanted to keep the family together for the sake of the children. Paul was deeply attached to his children and feared that the divorce would affect their mental state. He also feared that Jacqueline might make it difficult for him to communicate with his daughter and son. Despite his wife's constant cheating and lying, Paul was willing to put up with it so as not to destroy the family. To cope with the difficulties, he focused on work, tried to avoid conflicts with his wife, and did not pay attention to her rare appearances at home. Everyone around him saw how much effort Paul put into his family, but Jacqueline always remained dissatisfied, finding reasons to criticize. Paul's childhood best friend, Jean, had long considered their marriage loveless and repeatedly advised Paul to consider divorcing his unfaithful wife. Paul steadfastly refused, as he was determined to support his children and feared losing them. However, with each passing year, his resolve waned. Even Jacqueline's relatives recognized her tendency to humiliate her husband and children, as well as her aggressive behavior. They condemned Jackie and tried to persuade her to behave more decently, but all their efforts were in vain. Just a few days before his death, Paul went on a motorcycle tour along the coast of Spain with his best friend. This trip was the fulfillment of his long-held dream and provided him with an opportunity to take a break from family stress. During the trip, Paul confessed to his friend that his marriage was on the verge of falling apart, but he still wanted to keep the relationship alive for the sake of his children. He also reported regular threats from Jacqueline, who manipulated access to the children if he decided to leave her. Sadly, this journey proved to be Paul's last. A month before the tragedy, two men broke into Paul's home while he was asleep resting after work. At that moment, Jacqueline was not at home with her children, which seemed a strange coincidence. Paul woke up to a noise in the hallway and, thinking the family had returned from shopping, got up and called for his wife. Instead of her, one of the intruders came at him with a shovel. Paul managed to dodge and strike the attacker, but the second perpetrator drew him away, and both attackers eventually fled. The next day, Jacqueline provided a bizarre explanation for the incident, claiming that the attack was revenge for conflicts that had occurred during her time in the army. However, those close to her knew that Jacqueline had never served in the military, and her story was a complete lie. During the investigation, detectives uncovered several shocking facts that indicated a massive deception on Jacqueline's part. It turned out that Jackie had systematically manipulated her lover, Roger, turning him against Paul. She accused her husband of heinous crimes, including violent assaults, forced group intimacy with strange men, and infection with venereal diseases. In addition, Jacqueline made the absurd claim that she was expecting twins who allegedly died because of Paul's violent attacks. These false accusations clouded Roger's judgment, leading him to believe that Paul was systematically beating not only Jacqueline, but also their children. But her deception didn't end there. The investigation revealed that Jackie had repeatedly tried to find hired killers, willing to do away with Paul in exchange for a portion of the insurance payout. She even offered potential perpetrators a deal, promising them a generous reward for their favor, referring them to an upcoming insurance payout. These revelations dramatically changed the course of the investigation and called into question the entire story Jacqueline had presented. When Jacqueline realized that she could no longer manipulate her husband, she made the decision to part ways with him, maximizing financial gain for herself. In the event of his death, she would inherit all jointly acquired property and the substantial savings her husband had accumulated. Jacqueline's lover was believed to be aware of all these plans and willingly agreed to participate in her plan to help eliminate the problem. The judge described the crime as the ultimate expression of betrayal, comparing it to the biblical scale of adultery, which reflected the depth of the victim's faith. Paul fought to the last to keep his family together for the sake of his children, but his noble efforts turned into a tragedy that cost him his life. Jacqueline was never able to get life insurance on her spouse's life. The £300,000 was given to children who suddenly lost both parents. In 2013, Paul and Jacqueline's 22-year-old daughter, Danielle, publicly expressed her contempt for her mother in an interview. The girl said that even while behind bars, Jacqueline continued to manipulate the children using parental rights. She not only repeatedly called her daughter and son, but also tried to convince them of her innocence, offering money in exchange for freedom. During one visit, Jacqueline promised to sign a permission slip for school field trips, but her only interest was in securing her freedom. She insisted that the children support her cause and help secure her release. Danielle and her brother refused to visit their mother and help her, which resulted in Jacqueline not signing the necessary paperwork. As a result, the children were the only ones in the class who could not participate in field trips. The magnitude of Jacqueline's meanness was appalling. Danielle tearfully recalled how, just 2 weeks after her father's death, Jacqueline secretly burned all of his belongings, leaving nothing for the children to remember. Jacqueline seemed obsessed with erasing any memory of Paul. Danielle, despite the hardships, was able to keep a few photographs of her father. Jacqueline did not allow the children to live with Paul's parents, and they ended up in the care of strangers. This forced them to move to a different neighborhood, leaving behind school and old friends. Danielle and her brother were placed with different families, and their environment changed several times during their growing up years. The girl recalled how her family endured ridicule because of her mother's reputation, nicknamed the Black Widow. Children in new groups were often bullied because of this stigma. Danielle lived with 6 different families and faced serious challenges. As a teenager, she often ran away from home, and it wasn't until she was 17 that she managed to get her own apartment through social services. She went to college and began to rebuild her life. When she turned 18, she was finally free and received her share of the inheritance, which gave her a chance for a fresh start. Her convict mother could no longer influence her life. However, the past continued to haunt her. Later, when Danielle got a job as a kindergarten assistant, she met her boyfriend. For a long time, she avoided talking about her story, but when this confession took place, the boyfriend supported her, which strengthened their relationship and helped Danielle find inner peace. The court eventually handed down sentences for the perpetrators. Roger Ferguson was sentenced to 18 years in prison, Jacqueline received 20 years in prison, and Colin Robinson was sentenced to 3 years. Roger's 57-year-old mother was released and given probation for 1 year. For many, this was a welcome end to a horrific case, and the victims' relatives were relieved to learn that the brutal Jacqueline would be behind bars for years to come. The killer's own mother, seeing the extent of the betrayal and cruelty, felt that such people deserved the rest of their lives behind bars and would have preferred Jacqueline to never go free. For Paul's daughter, Danielle, Jacqueline's 20 years in prison seems too lenient a punishment. She claims it is not just an injustice, but a true mockery of her loss and the suffering her mother caused her and her brother. Danielle has openly admitted to reporters that she is horrified at the prospect that Jacqueline, 40, will soon be released from prison and may reappear in her life. As her incarceration began, everyone turned their backs on Jacqueline, and her former entourage left her to fend for herself. The only one who continued to visit her was a father named Ronnie. He came to the prison regularly for the first 9 years, but as the years went by, his visits became less and less frequent. When Jacqueline's brother passed away, she wanted to attend his funeral, but her own family urged her to stay in prison and stay out of their business. In 2027, when Jacqueline's sentence expires, she will be released. Her constant denials of her guilt only cause more fear among those who remember her crimes. People fear not only that Jacqueline will be free again, but that her return could bring more trouble and destruction. Whether she can ever atone for her crimes remains an open and unspeakably tragic question for those who lived through her dark legacy. The consequences of combat can haunt a person for the rest of his life, and psychological help not provided in time turns invisible wounds into deadly threats. Zachary Bowen was one of those who returned from the war, but could not get back to himself. It seemed he had already lost everything: his career, his family, his own future. But when the screams disappear in a quiet French Quarter apartment, a silence erupts that hides something far more sinister. The police officers who entered the apartment a few weeks after the incident had no idea that what awaited them there was not just a crime scene, but a nightmare they would remember for the rest of their lives. There were pots and pans in the kitchen, and there was no smell of decomposition. But the scariest part was the diary, which revealed all the horrors of Zach's last days turning into something unimaginably dangerous. Sometimes silence can be scarier than screams, and salvation for some becomes doom for others. 12 days after Eddie's murder, Zach walked into a local bar in the French Quarter, ordered a few drinks, and then climbed to the roof of the establishment. The bartenders were worried that he wasn't going to pay for the drinks, and their fears were confirmed. Just minutes later, Zach jumped off the roof head first and crashed to his death. Law enforcement officers who arrived on the scene found a note in the young man's pocket. A loud bang, and it was over. Or maybe that's when it all started. That's what the police thought as they looked at the note in his blood-soaked hand. And somewhere in the pages of the diary, everything was already predetermined. A real shock awaited the law enforcement officers in the apartment. The first thing the police noticed was the low temperature in the apartment and the lack of odor. It was like a refrigerator inside. There was no odor of body decomposition, and there was no trace of blood in the bathroom. But a horrible discovery awaited them in the kitchen. They also found a diary detailing all the actions and thoughts that visited the head of the distraught young man in the last days of his life. By his admission, the girl's body began to smell even worse with each passing day. This case shocked the whole of New Orleans. People were shocked at how the real heroes rebuilding the ruins after Hurricane Katrina became a killer and a victim. The details of the crime were staggering. Forensic experts analyzed everything that happened and came to the conclusion that Zach was distraught from a number of factors. He was unable to recover from post-traumatic stress disorder, which was only exacerbated by alcohol and illegal substances. Zach blamed himself for all of life's failures. He was unable to build a career, connect with his children, lost his spouse, lost his friends, and then killed his girlfriend. He was under the constant pressure of circumstances that pressed down on him with an insurmountable weight that he could not tell anyone about. Zach Bowen was a vivid illustration of how devastating events experienced in war can be. It proves once again how important it is to give support and seek help from professionals. Perhaps if the hero of the story had received such help, the story of the couple who miraculously survived Hurricane Katrina would have ended very differently. Residents of neighboring apartments witnessed paranormal phenomena. They reported hearing voices and seeing images near the scene. At one point, they even organized tours of the place. In that diary, Zach wrote how Addie tried to kick him out of the apartment, how an argument started that turned into a fight. He detailed how humiliating her words sounded. Eventually, he lost control of himself. At that point, Zach was using a lot of heavy substances and appeared to be in an altered state of consciousness. In his diary, he also described his feelings and admitted that he still felt love for Addie despite her dead body lying on the floor. But the death of Zach Bowens and the discoveries made in his apartment were only the tip of the iceberg. Behind this final act of horror was a long chain of events, mistakes, and unseen wounds that slowly but inevitably led to disaster. This is the story of how one man, lost in his demons, crossed the line and dragged others down into the abyss. Let us now find out what really happened. What made this once valiant soldier and hero become a killer? How did an ordinary relationship turn into a nightmare? Let's get to know the main characters and step by step reveal the whole horrifying picture of the crime, which became the final point of a ruined life. But before we get to the grim end, let's go back to the beginning. To a time when everything still seemed possible. A time when Zach Bones was just a man trying to survive, but found himself on a path from which there was no turning back. In 1995, Zachary Bowen went on a little road trip across the United States with his father. Zach was a young, confident, and charming young man. This trip was an important moment for him, because it introduced him to a place that would change his life forever: New Orleans, Louisiana. When their trip took them to this colorful city, Zach instantly fell in love with its atmosphere. The pulsating energy, the music, the nightlife, it all captivated him. However, his father soon decided to move on, continuing their itinerary. But Zachary stayed behind. It was as if the city was calling him, offering more than just another point in the journey. And Zach decided to start a new life right here. Without much thought, he found a job at a local bar and quickly settled into the city. One day, in the dim light of the neon lights, he met Lana, a dancer from Texas. Lana was 10 years older than him, but her free-spirited nature and cheerfulness made her close to him. They instantly felt a mutual affection, and soon their relationship was growing as fast as the city itself. However, the romance that seemed so simple and easy soon became complicated. Lana became pregnant. At the time, Zach was only 18 years old, and Lana was 28. Her torn between love and fear of the future, mixed with the age difference, made her consider ending the relationship. She wasn't sure if young Zach was ready for such a major change. However, Zach surprised her. Not only was he not scared of fatherhood, but he showed unexpected maturity. He was ready to take on the responsibility of a future family. This decision influenced Lana, and despite her inner doubts, she gave their relationship a chance. Nevertheless, the age difference continued to worry her. She realized that Zach's youth could eventually become a barrier for him in building a family. Zach, for his part, sacrificed his education plans for his family. He dreamed of becoming an English teacher, but chose a different road, the road of love and responsibility. Soon they were married, and life promised to be full of both challenges and joyful moments. But no one could have predicted how difficult and dark it would become. After a while, Lana became pregnant again, and their family had 2 children to provide for. The young father urgently needed money and a more stable, high-paying job. However, it was difficult to find a suitable position in New Orleans, especially without a college degree. The boy had only a high school diploma. Feeling the pressure of rising costs, he decided to join the army. He was soon deployed to Iraq. The Iraqi reality was radically different from the familiar family life Zach had left behind in New Orleans. Where once there was the warmth and comfort of home, there was now danger and fear of death lurking around every corner. The fighting and the loss of friends he had befriended in the service had left a deep imprint on his soul. Zachary wanted more and more to return home, where his sick wife was waiting for him. Lana had been diagnosed with hepatitis C. For the sake of it, he began deliberately failing health and fitness tests. The plan worked, and he was sent home, but with one serious loss: he lost all his military benefits. The return to civilian life proved equally devastating. Serious psychological trauma haunted him, though Zach never complained and rarely talked about his experiences in Iraq. Any talk on the subject drove him into a deep melancholy. Lana noticed that he had become cold and distant, as if his former feelings for her and the children had completely disappeared. She tried to reconnect with her husband, but her efforts were in vain. Over time, Lana realized that the marriage was broken and made the decision to part ways with Zach. Lana later admitted that she no longer saw him as the man she once married. She had no idea what a heavy burden Zach was carrying on his shoulders. At the age of 27, he was a free man, a former military man who had survived the war but was broken by its horrors. Lana gained custody of the children, and Zach returned to his old life, taking a job at a bar in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Zach quickly became popular with the bar's patrons, especially the women. Charismatic and charming, he masterfully mixed cocktails and easily found a common language with others. His attractiveness and ability to flirt attracted attention, and many considered him not only smart, but also a charming man. In the same bar, he met a colleague, Adriana Hall, whom everyone called Eddie. Unlike him, Eddie was a different kind of person. She belonged to a movement close to the ideology of hippies, and was independent, creative, and a little mysterious. At first, Eddie did not take Zach seriously, not considering him a person with whom she could find a common language. However, his persistence and attention soon broke down her defenses. Zach was determined to win her favor, and despite their initial differences, they began to bond. Addie, who worked as a bartender, gradually began to respond to his advances. A few weeks before Hurricane Katrina hit the Louisiana coast, their relationship took a new level. However, during this period, Zach had his own secrets, which he was in no hurry to reveal to his new lover. She didn't know that he had a wife and 2 children. Addie found out about it already when the hurricane was coming to the coast, and it made her resentful. To make matters worse, the situation was exacerbated when Lana, Zach's ex-wife, showed up on the horizon and turned to him for help. Because of the disaster, all the institutions of the city closed down, and Lana, left alone with 2 small children, found herself in a difficult situation. With no job and no car, she saw no other option but to turn to Zach for help at this critical time. Addie was filled with anxiety when she learned that Zach was going to visit his ex-wife. Even though it involved his children, she was overcome with dread. She feared that he might return to Lana, and then their relationship would be jeopardized. Tensions mounted, and soon there was a serious conflict between them. In the end, Zach decided to stay with Eddie, which, of course, made Lana furious. The couple stayed in Zach's apartment, located in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter. They resolutely refused to leave their walls, despite the authorities' instructions for mandatory evacuation, confident that they could withstand the onslaught of the elements. However, they did not realize the true extent of the devastation the hurricane would bring. For the first few days, they closely followed the news on television, tracking the cyclone's progress, until a sudden power outage left them in the dark. When Hurricane Katrina hit the coast, Zach and Eddie realized the power and devastation of the storm. It was the strongest hurricane in U.S. history, with wind gusts up to 124 miles per hour that swept away everything in its path. They took shelter in their apartment, hearing the deadly wind howling outside their window, relying on the protection of their thin walls. Fortunately, their apartment remained unharmed. When the storm subsided, it left behind apocalyptic chaos. About 80% of the city was flooded. Occasional screams and even gunshots rang through the streets. Lana, Zach's ex-wife, tried to contact him, worried about his fate, but it was impossible to find out about his condition. Nevertheless, Zach and Eddie survived. Much of the historic French Quarter remained intact, except for fallen trees and scattered debris. Their apartment miraculously survived the powerful winds, an event they took as a symbol of the resilience of their relationship. After the storm, their feelings only grew stronger, despite the ordeal. Zach and Eddie were active in helping other survivors. They cleaned up fallen trees, cooked food, and gave it to the needy on the street. They even threw impromptu parties to cheer themselves up during this difficult time. Thanks to their efforts, a close-knit group of survivors formed around them, who began to see Zach and Eddie as their guides. The lovers perceived everything that was happening as a romantic adventure, continuing to build their love in the ruins of New Orleans, not realizing how fleeting happiness can be. With the lack of communication, the extent of the devastation was so severe that it took a long time for government services to gather information on survivors and reach those remaining in the city. For some time, these people were left to fend for themselves, which only increased mutual support and unity in a crisis situation. Eddie's loved ones and Zach's ex-wife, unable to contact them for weeks, began to expect the worst. But finally, rescuers along with a camera crew reached them and their story was reported. Zach and Eddie instantly became French Quarter celebrities and even made the cover of the New York Times. The couple not only helped many people get out from under the rubble, but also supported those around them as they helped them cope with the aftermath of the hurricane. At this point, they were able to contact their family, and Zach was the first to call his mother. Despite the devastation around them, they remained in good spirits. They liked to feel important, and it gave them strength. Their loved ones were happy that everything was okay, but that didn't concern Lana, who had almost resigned herself to the thought of the death of the father of her children. After all the worries, the couple remained living in New Orleans, enjoying their popularity and carefree life. Almost a month passed, but Lana never heard from her ex-husband. Suddenly, she came across a magazine cover where Zach was peacefully barbecuing with his new girlfriend. This sent her into a storm of emotions, anger, and despair. Because while she was worried about them, Zach was enjoying life. At that moment, Lana was out of work and destitute, and her perception of Zach's actions became a personal affront. It was shocking that her ex-spouse could behave in such a carefree manner. In the meantime, the city began to regain its former shape. The power and communications were back on, and Lana was finally able to contact Zach. They arranged to meet at the bar where he worked. Zach, Eddie, and Lana attended the meeting. A woman, feeling bossy, reprimanded them like teenagers, insisting that Zach had an obligation to help her and the children, demanding financial support. Addie felt jealousy fill her heart as she watched Zach's ex-wife try to take control of the situation. From that moment on, their perfect world began to crumble. The once heroic and colorful couple began to lose popularity, sinking into ordinary life, where their contribution to the rebuilding of the city was quickly forgotten. Problems began to pile up, and the couple became addicted to alcohol and illegal substances. This had started while they were still rebuilding, but was now the only way to cope. Zach continued to send money to his children, but it wasn't enough, not for rent, food, or bills. Amidst the mounting problems, Zach and Eddie's relationship began to disintegrate, and their future became uncertain. Zach found himself in a difficult situation. His income was barely enough to support himself and his children, and to maintain his relationship with Eddie. Financial difficulties were exacerbated by the pressures of the effects of brain injury, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, he had suffered while serving in the military. One of the hardest memories for Zach was the death of an Iraqi family he had managed to befriend. When the insurgents learned of his help to them, they massacred the family members, including a child. This tragic event haunted Zach, and he could not rid himself of the guilt he felt, believing himself to be the cause of their deaths. Despite his deep depression, Zach never sought help from professionals, preferring to hide his pain behind the mask of a cheerful person. Only those closest to him, including Addie, knew about his inner demons, but even she didn't fully realize the seriousness of his condition. Instead of seeking support, Zach tried to drown his worries in alcohol and prohibition, which only aggravated his suffering. All of these events were putting a tremendous amount of stress on him, especially against the backdrop of Addie's growing popularity. She continued to work as a bartender, and the attention from the customers only made Zach more jealous. Gradually, his aggression became more frequent. He began to take it out on Addie, accusing her of flirting with the men who came into the bar. Addie tried to justify herself by claiming that her friendliness helped her earn good tips. In fact, she had used this tactic from the beginning, because friendly employees always get more. Before the hurricane, Zach hadn't been so anxious, but now, amidst all the other problems, his reaction to what was happening had become more acute. Addie was convinced that his substance use was making him aggressive and angry. Zach was increasingly turning to hard substances, and under their influence his behavior became unpredictable when combined with alcohol. Addie was also facing her own psychological problems. She suffered from bipolar disorder, and her irregular use of medication was causing her outbursts of anger and uncontrollable rage, which only exacerbated the conflicts in their couple. Zach, feeling increasingly lost and angry, began spending nights out of the house, perhaps to purposely arouse Addie's jealousy. She understood his intentions and threatened to break up. Eventually, the tension between them led to an argument that ended in a physical confrontation. Zach hit Addie for the first time. The next day, Zach bought a ticket to Washington and told his friends that he had broken up with Eddie and was going to start a new life in another state. However, he didn't tell his girlfriend anything. In the morning, she found a note on her pillow in which Zach wrote that he was leaving town for good. That same day, Eddie's co-workers noticed bruises on her body. She admitted that they were the aftermath of a conflict with Zach before his escape. Despite everything, she didn't hold a grudge against him, though she looked depressed about the breakup. However, their story was far from over. Within a week, Zach began complaining to his friends about his strong desire to return to New Orleans to Addie. He realized how much he loved her, and the couple often chatted on the phone. Both admitted that they couldn't live apart. A few weeks later, Zach returned to New Orleans, but it didn't change their lifestyle. They started abusing alcohol and illegal substances again, and the aggression in their relationship only increased. In groups of friends, they provoked fights, which caused those around them to avoid them. No one wanted to deal with their inappropriate behavior. Zach and Eddie were having more and more fights, which were getting more and more violent. On weekends, they would show up with broken faces and bruises. At work, Eddie began to be reprimanded because she looked haggard, as if she was suffering from alcoholism. Many people witnessed their conflicts when they would say terrible words to each other, but the next morning they would find themselves together again. Over time, no one paid attention to their threats anymore. Their relationship was like a roller coaster. The conflicts became more and more frequent and annoyed the neighbors. One night, Addie kicked Zach out of the apartment. He banged on the door for hours, demanding to be let back in, and the tenants, tired of the noise, called the police. Although Zach calmed down, it didn't improve their relationship. The couple was on the verge of breaking up, and Zach decided to move out again. By that point, he was doing well. He was working hard at the bar, getting good tips, and even managed to put a down payment on a small studio apartment near the French Quarter. However, Eddie spoiled his plans by going to the police and accusing Zach of domestic abuse. As a result, his new landlord refused to give him a place to live. Meanwhile, Addie put all of his belongings out the door. She decided to finally destroy him by accusing him of being a bad father and a loser. This really pissed Zach off, and then the irreparable happened. The ex-military man stormed into the apartment and started choking Addie. He couldn't stop until she stopped showing signs of life. His mind was filled with dark thoughts, including suicide and escape. Instead, he pulled out the dead girl's diary and began to write down some sort of account of what had happened. A few days passed, and employers became concerned when they noticed Zach and Eddie's absence from work. Friends and neighbors noticed that their apartment had become too quiet. The shouting and fighting had stopped. Neighbors tried to call them, but to no avail. At the same time, in the warm apartment, Eddie's body began to decompose and the odor became extremely unpleasant. Despite his constant state of intoxication, Zach realized that something had to be done about the situation. He turned on the air conditioner at maximum power to lower the temperature in the apartment and put Eddie's body in a tub of cold water to slow down the decomposition process. He recorded all his actions in detail in a diary. Zach then decided to solve the problems with his employer. He reported that Addie had gone to North Carolina and they had broken up. He asked for a few days' vacation to come to his senses, and his request was met with understanding. In the days that followed, Zach repeatedly met with friends and acquaintances, but everyone noticed that he was looking worse and worse. He stopped shaving and taking care of himself, blaming his condition on the difficult feelings he had experienced after his breakup with Addie. Although he continued to claim that she had gone to North Carolina, several people began to suspect that something was wrong. However, no one went to the police, as everyone knew that Addie was a free-spirited and rebellious nature. Disappearing without warning was quite in her nature, although some people were still surprised, because Addie loved this city very much. In the days that followed, Zach was immersed in the world of alcohol and illicit drugs. He used substances uncontrollably and had indiscriminate sex with various women. In one of his intoxicants, he called Lana, offering to meet and have fun like in the old days. Lana immediately realized that her ex-husband was depressed and refused to meet. She tried to find out if Addie had really gone to North Carolina, but Zach insisted. That conversation was the last conversation after which he disappeared from the lives of everyone who cared about him. Soon, Zach began to suffer from severe psychosis. He self-mutilated and burned himself, one for every year of his life. He turned 28 years old, and at that age, he was on the edge of a precipice. The young man stopped answering his cell phone and did not show up for work for weeks. Even though his vacation was long over, Lana and his mother were worried sick about him. No information about Zach was forthcoming, and everyone was expecting the worst. One day, Zach finally responded to Lana's text message, saying that he was going to spend the evening at the club. He took a large bag of illegal substances with him and headed to the strip club, where he seemed to be enjoying life again, partying with the dancers and drinking alcohol until the wee hours of the morning. When he returned home, however, he was once again faced with reality. Eddie's body was still waiting for him in the apartment. According to his diary entries, during this period, Zach was sinking deeper and deeper into madness. He spray-painted the walls of his apartment, writing lists of his failures. In his mind, he had failed in every aspect of his life. His relationships with friends, at work, in the military, lost love, and destroyed his bond with Lana. He destroyed everything of value he had, and in the diary, he detailed the reasons why things had gone so tragically wrong. In the diary, Zach confessed to killing Eddie and expressed his decision to kill himself, believing it was the only way to atone for all his sins. He listed the address where he lived with his girlfriend and noted that police would find her body inside, as well as his diary detailing his confessions and their last days together in the apartment. The first thing that caught the police officer's eye was the overwhelming atmosphere of insanity that enveloped the apartment. The walls were covered with writings in which Zach mercilessly blamed himself for his failures. He begged for help and searched for a way to stop his suffering, leaving disturbing writings that reflected his inner struggle. Of course, no one could hear these silent cries for help. The inside of the apartment was very cold. There was no odor of decomposing bodies, and there was no trace of blood in the bathroom. But in the kitchen, a horrible discovery awaited the police. In large pots, they found cooked parts of Eddie's body. One pot contained a human thigh, another a hairless head that had apparently been boiled for a long time because the skin had peeled away from the skull. All the pans contained different parts of Eddie's body, cut apart and cooked by the killer. The torso of the murdered woman was found in a large black garbage bag in the refrigerator. According to Zach's admission from the diary, the girl's body began to smell worse by the day, so he decided to split it up and cook it so the flesh would stop rotting. According to detectives, there was no evidence that the perpetrator ate his victim. Rather, he was trying to solve the decomposition problem in this unusual way. The detectives who discovered the gruesome scene admitted that it was forever imprinted on their minds and was the most horrifying memory they had in all their years of service. On the second floor, where the faint light barely illuminated the walls, a nightmare scene unfolded. The woman's body lay as if she had been deliberately hidden from view. Blood, thick and dark, soaked the carpet like a living shadow, leaving behind gruesome signs of struggle. She tried to run away, but every step she took was met with blows. Bloody prints on the stairs testified to her bleeding as she tried to escape. This house was the beginning of the end for her, and whoever had come into it with the knife was also familiar to her. He knew how to disable the alarm system, how to make sure no one heard her scream. But what could have driven him to such cruelty? In this quiet place, among familiar walls, a nightmare had played out, the origin of which no one could have predicted. It wasn't just a murder. It was a massacre that left behind more questions than answers. David, along with his 2 daughters, were forced to flee to North Carolina as they became the subject of intense media scrutiny. According to David, he was severely hurt by the rumors that were spread after the events. The media portrayed him in a negative light, making up one untruth after another, which almost completely ruined his reputation as a respected doctor and a good father. Daniel's release came as a new shock to their family. They feared that the real culprit might want revenge. However, according to Daniel's own assurance, he was able to enjoy freedom and overcome his addiction for the first time in 4 years, so he had no intentions of revenge. However, the feeling of freedom did not last long. The Alabama Court of Appeals reviewed the decision to release him. All trials were suspended, and just a week later Daniel was back behind bars. Now he was to remain in prison until the appeals court made its decision. He faced 2 options: a new trial or double jeopardy. In the latter case, a retrial could be seen as an attempt to convict him twice for the same crime, which would result in his eventual release. During this period, Daniel's lawyer continued to fight for his release. The prosecutor's office persisted in its version of events, believing him guilty of taking the woman's life. The lawyer tried to gain access to the computer and phone number of Karen's husband, suspecting his involvement in the crime, but was repeatedly rebuffed. He finally managed to discover that someone with access to the Tipton home had deleted files from the computer after Karen's death, but before they were handed over to the police, and the data could not be recovered. This seemed highly suspicious. In addition, the lawyer again drew attention to the testimony of road workers who had seen the deceased's husband arrive that day an hour earlier than he had reported the incident to the police. No one else was seen outside the house, which seemed like direct evidence against the widower. The lawyer's fight for justice lasted a decade. In the end, After a brief pause of just 1 week, Daniel spent all those years behind bars. In his third trial, held on May 14, 2009, a jury found him not guilty. This came as a real shock to the prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor publicly stated that Daniel Moore was the perpetrator and the jury had made a serious error. After the acquittal, Daniel left Alabama and began seeking legal counsel to file a civil lawsuit against the city of Docket and its police department. He claimed that his constitutional rights had been violated and that he had spent 10 years in prison for nothing. However, his lawsuit was dismissed. The murder of a beautiful and respected woman, the wife of a doctor, could not go unnoticed in this quiet and peaceful town. The community was outraged and put pressure on the police to act quickly to make the streets safe. Rumors of a brutal massacre began to spread among the locals. Some suspected a husband, others a lover, and still others thought it might have been the wife of one of her many admirers. The situation changed dramatically a month after the tragedy. Police were in pursuit of a thief trying to flee in a car. After the crash, they apprehended 24-year-old Daniel Wade Moore. Just 48 hours later, law enforcement was certain he was the one who killed Karen. 2 days after his arrest, when Daniel was released on bail, he confessed to his uncle, Sparky Moore, that he had been at the couple's home on Chapel Hill Road. According to him, he and 2 accomplices entered the house assuming no one would be there. However, inside they unexpectedly encountered Karen. Daniel stated that the situation took him by surprise and he killed the woman in a panic. This confession shocked Daniel's family. Sparky, without thinking long, informed the police of his nephew's involvement in the crime. Daniel was soon tracked down and apprehended at the motel where he was staying for a few days. Accessories for the manufacture and use of illegal substances were also found there. The young man was arrested again and taken to the police station for questioning. A few hours later, when detectives took a 5-minute break, Daniel took advantage of the moment and stabbed himself 16 times with a penknife. When police officers returned, he was bleeding from multiple shallow wounds. The pain and blood loss had weakened him so much that he had to be sent to the hospital instead of further questioning. Based on the behavior of the prime suspect, the detectives were confident that they had apprehended the right man. Daniel had an obvious problem with illegal substances, and valuables were missing from the victim's home. He had no alibi for the day Karen was killed. Plus, his suicide attempt during the first interrogation seemed like direct evidence of his guilt. However, it required further confirmation. Security was on duty outside the wounded suspect's room while detectives continued to investigate. The apartment of a young man in his 20s was searched, and an important piece of evidence was found. A toolbox of tools from a company that installed alarm systems was discovered. It was this company that installed the alarm system in the Tipton house, and Daniel worked there. Investigators interviewed the widower, and David, looking at the photograph, confirmed that it was Daniel who had come to their home several months before the tragedy to install the system. According to detectives, the faulty alarm system was the key to all doors for the criminals. The perpetrator could have simply knocked on the door and introduced himself as a repairman coming to fix the malfunction. Karen could have recognized him and so quietly let him into the house. But he attacked her and took her life. Since the suspect's confession had not yet been obtained, the police had to reconstruct a picture of the events on the basis of the results of forensic examination and evidence found in the house. However, there was no direct evidence. No footprints, fingerprints, or DNA could be found. Even the alleged intimate molestation left no traces or fluids to analyze. The attack apparently began on the first floor, near the front door where a drop of blood was found. As experts believed, the first blow was struck in the victim's neck area. After that, the woman was forced up to the second floor, leaving drops of blood behind her. Her torn clothes were found in the bedroom, and the bed was drenched in blood. At one point, Karen managed to break free from her attacker's grasp, and she even made it to the stairs. Here, however, she was caught up and killed with a knife. The confession that Daniel made to his uncle linked him 100% to the crime. According to law enforcement, he completely matched the criminal profile compiled by FBI specialists. People who knew him described him as a violent man with a history of addiction to illegal substances. He was probably under the influence and out of control at the time of the crime. Even if he wasn't, his psyche was so unstable that he could have attacked Karen for no apparent reason. When the suspect regained consciousness in the hospital and was able to talk to investigators, he adamantly refused to admit his guilt. Daniel claimed that he was not in the house on the day of the crime, and that he had no idea who might be involved in the crime. Despite this, he did not retract his confession to his uncle, but assured the police that it was false. According to him, he was under a lot of pressure at the time because of legal problems, and his grandfather and uncle added to that pressure. He confessed to a crime he did not commit on purpose to scare off his uncle and get his relatives to stop interfering in his life. The young man's words sounded like incoherent ramblings, to which no one paid any attention. Suddenly, however, his uncle, Sparky Moore, changed his position and sided with Daniel. After considering all the circumstances, his uncle concluded that the story of the murder could have been made up by his nephew to divert his eyes. Sparky claimed that Daniel's only real problem was his addiction to illegal substances. He wanted it to finally be over, to go back to his old life, as he could no longer fight the hardships of his addiction. His grandfather and uncle actively tried to set him on the right path, but Neil decided to scare them off by inventing a fictitious crime. Even some detectives began to doubt that this young man, with obvious problems, could have been involved in taking Karen's life. As a result of years of court battles and constant public pressure, the case of Karen Tipton's murder and the fate of Daniel Moore has become a true epic. But to truly understand how this tangled and tragic plot came to be, let's go back to the beginning. Who was Daniel Moore, and how did he end up at the center of such a high-profile case? And who was Karen Tipton, whose life was brutally cut short? Understanding the true circumstances of their story requires diving into that fateful night when tragedy struck and analyzing all the details that led to such unexpected and dramatic consequences. Let's go back to the beginning and figure out how it all started. Who was involved in these events, and what really happened? Let's start our journey back to the night Karen was murdered and trace all the key moments that formed the basis of this complex and tragic story. When David Tipton was a medical student doing his residency at a hospital in Alabama in 1984, he met nurse Karen Kraft. Their relationship began as a friendship, but over time developed into romantic feelings. 5 years after meeting Karen admitted to her brother and sister that David, the ideal candidate for the role of husband and father of their future children. She saw him as a calm, reliable, and pleasant man with whom she was ready to spend the rest of her life. June 24, 1989. They celebrated a lavish wedding and then moved to the quiet town of Decatur, Alabama, where they both got a job at the local hospital. Here, in their new home, the couple had 2 daughters, and their family's life went on in a measured and happy manner. They maintained good relations with their neighbors, attended church regularly, and looked like a model family from the outside. Everything was fine until one day their quiet life changed forever. On March 12, 1999, David, 39, recalled the day as unremarkable. Everyone was minding their own business, looking forward to the evening family dinner and watching television. Karen, having left her job after the birth of her children, became a homemaker and did the daily chores while David was on shift at the hospital. That afternoon, he returned home a little earlier than usual, as he and his wife planned to go to the theater. Almost immediately, however, he was overcome with anxiety. Approaching the house from the garage, David noticed that the front door was unlocked, which was highly unusual for them, as they always made sure the doors were locked. Deciding that Karen might have simply forgotten to lock the door or left it open for the delivery man, he went inside. However, his unease increased when he saw the removed panel from the security alarm on the kitchen counter. Although it looked odd, David didn't immediately give it serious consideration since the alarm hadn't worked in a while and they were waiting for it to be fixed. However, the idea that Karen would have decided to remove the panel before the handyman arrived seemed completely illogical to him. On his way to work in the morning, David noticed that the alarm panel was in its usual place, and there were no scheduled visits from the security company for the day. When he returned home, he headed to the hallway to hang up his coat and suddenly noticed a small drop of blood on the floor tiles. He didn't think much of it at first, thinking it might have been an accidental scratch or a nosebleed from a family member. He called out to Karen, but there was silence in response. The children didn't respond either, although the house was usually always noisy at this time. Assuming they might have been on the second floor and hadn't heard him, David headed for the stairs. But a few more drops of blood appeared on the floor, making him wary. When he reached the stairs, he was overcome with anxiety. Next to the door in the hall, he saw a smeared blood stain, as if someone had tried to wipe it off. The stain was quite large, and David immediately realized that someone might have been seriously hurt. He called out for his loved ones again, but the silence grew more and more ominous. As he went up to the second floor, David realized the reason for this oppressive silence. His wife lay before him, naked and mutilated with multiple stab wounds, her throat slit. He could barely contain himself from shock, but he immediately dialed the emergency services, saying that he had found his wife dead and could not find his children. Several police cars and an ambulance immediately arrived at the scene. The law enforcement officers urgently started looking for the children, and fortunately, it turned out that they were still at school. No one had taken them away. When the police arrived on the scene, they saw a horrifying scene. The victim had 28 stab wounds on his body, several of which were fatal. Forensic investigators began their examination and determined that the death occurred sometime between 1 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. At 1 p.m., Karen was on the phone with a friend. A witness reported that the conversation was normal and calm, with no signs of agitation in Karen's voice. Karen was scheduled to go to school at 2:30 a.m. to pick up her children, but by that time she was dead. Naturally, investigators immediately turned their attention to David, who had found his wife's body. They hoped that he would be able to provide information about a possible perpetrator. However, David could not name a single person who could have massacred a 39-year-old housewife and mother of 2 children. Since Karen was found naked, investigators speculated that the crime may have had an intimate motive. David also reported that a purse containing money and several pieces of jewelry were missing, but a diamond ring remained on the victim's finger. In addition, although the garage door was open, no signs of forced entry were found in the home. Investigators were shocked by the brutality of the attack. It didn't look like a robbery gone wrong or a random self-defense. The perpetrator had clearly come with the intent to commit a violent crime. At the time of Karen's death, the eldest daughter, Carolyn, was only 7 years old, and the youngest, Catherine, only 3 years old. Naturally, David became the first suspect. He realized that suspicion would fall on him when he called the emergency services, but had no other choice. He hoped for a fair investigation as he was at work at the time of the attack, and was confident that all suspicions would be cleared from him after the first interview. David claimed that not only was he not in town at the time of the crime, but he was also not working at the hospital. After detectives spoke with David, they proceeded to verify his alibi. The hospital manager confirmed that David left the hospital at 3:30 a.m. and did not return home until 4:15 a.m. The 911 call came in at 4:27 p.m., which coincided with the time of his gruesome discovery in the house. No scratches were found on David's body indicating attempts at self-defense, and his clothes were clean of blood. These facts made it possible to rule him out as a suspect. For David, it was a significant relief, but for the detectives, the situation was exacerbated. Taking David off the suspect list left them with no new leads. Law enforcement had no other suspects, and no one close to Karen could imagine who would be so violent as to stab her 28 times. Looking for a solution to the problem, police enlisted the help of the FBI to create a psychological profile of the potential perpetrator. However, despite the efforts of both services, no significant progress was made. Extensive data was compiled and analyzed, formalized in a report of more than 200 pages, which became the basis for further investigations. The whole case was based on circumstantial evidence. No direct evidence against him was ever collected. Several workers who were paving in front of Karen's house on the day of the crime did not see Neil enter the house. No fingerprints were found in the Tipton's garage or in the rooms drenched in blood to link him to the crime. Searches of his apartment, motel room, and automobile also yielded no physical evidence of his presence at the crime scene. Virtually everyone around Daniel was now convinced that he was incapable of such a brutal crime. His older sister and mother insisted that despite his legal and addiction problems, he was a man of conscience and would never raise his hand against a defenseless woman. His addiction to illegal substances began to haunt him from his teenage years, and he was repeatedly prosecuted for this reason. Up until that point, however, Daniel had never been in trouble with the law for violence. He had never even been in a fight. Daniel attributed his suicide attempt to a nervous breakdown. He claimed that he had never thought about killing someone else in his life. The only person he could have pointed a gun at was himself. Under questioning, he lost control of himself, fearing that he might be accused of someone else's crime. He did not really want to die, but was gripped by despair and could not cope with the pressure of the situation. According to him, the police officers put him under a lot of moral pressure during the interrogation, humiliating him in front of his own family. The officers told him he would remain a hardened criminal and addicted to illegal substances, something he eventually began to believe himself. When the cops got out, he found no other way to turn his life around other than to try to kill himself. In retrospect, Daniel admitted that it was the biggest mistake of his life. However, the police had no other suspects and were convinced that he was involved in the crime. In October 2001, Daniel Moore was charged with murder, a capital offense in the state of Alabama. He was represented by an experienced attorney with 30 years of experience who believed in his client's innocence. The attorney believed that the investigation had made a mistake and that the crime was a crime of passion committed by someone close to the victim. In his eyes, David Tipton was a suitable suspect, but the list of possible perpetrators could have been much broader. On November 4th, 2002, Daniel went to trial. The prosecutor's office insisted that they had enough evidence to consider Moore the perpetrator, claiming that the crime was the result of a robbery that had gone awry. However, not everyone who followed the trial was convinced of his guilt. People who knew the accused argued that he was incapable of such a brutal crime. Besides, if money was his goal, he could have chosen a less conspicuous target. A house in the center of the city that was attacked in broad daylight, especially since a traffic office was operating across the street, seemed a highly unsuitable target for a robbery. These facts raised serious concerns among many who followed the case. Perhaps the real culprit was still at large and could continue to commit crimes. The brutality of the crime was too great, even for a man under the influence of illegal substances. The robbery version seemed unlikely, since the perpetrator had no real reason to kill the woman, even if she caught him in the act. An independent expert engaged by the defense argued that the crime was personal. He suggested that such crimes often start with a conversation, escalating into an argument, then a fight, and eventually ending in a stabbing. There were two ways the perpetrator could have gotten into the house. Either Karen let him in herself, or he had a key. Either way, it was someone she knew. The expert also scrutinized the method of dismantling the alarm system and concluded that the method clearly pointed to someone other than the defendant. According to him, a professional alarm system installer would have known how to completely disable the system without removing the keypad or leaving traces. In addition, the expert examined blood traces in the house and concluded that the victim did not initially try to escape, but moved slowly or even stood still. It was only on the second floor, in the bedroom, that she was attacked again. While attempting to escape, Karen received several blows to her back that proved fatal. According to the expert, the key events unfolded on the second floor of the house, in the hallway where Karen was fatally wounded. After her death, the body was moved so that it could not be seen from the first floor. This indicated that the perpetrator was familiar with the layout of the house, perhaps having visited or even lived there frequently. The traces of blood on the second floor had been erased, indicating an attempt to conceal the crime. The expert noted that such behavior is uncharacteristic of a burglar, who usually hurries to leave the scene of a crime to avoid apprehension. The defense argued that Daniel Moore was not necessarily the only possible perpetrator. The prime suspect, they argued, could have been Karen's husband, David Tipton, who was immediately ruled out as a suspect. In court, highway workers who were working nearby on the day of the crime confirmed that they had seen David's pickup truck outside the house at least an hour before the police arrived. The defense put forward the theory that David may have had a motive for the crime: jealousy. It was revealed that in the months before Karen's death, she had been having an affair on the side, which could have caused the tragedy. A neighbor claimed to have repeatedly seen a light-colored pickup truck parked outside the house, indicating frequent visits. In addition, David himself admitted at trial that a few weeks before the tragedy, his best friend Mike had sent Karen an email suggesting a temporary partner swap. This badly hurt David, who was resentful of both Mike and his wife allegedly meeting in secret. Karen, for her part, may not have been happy with her husband. On the day of his death, She used his computer and found that the hard drive was almost completely filled with specific adult movies, which may have shocked and angered her. Arguably, upon returning home, David may have had a conflict with his wife that escalated into tragedy. However, David vehemently denied involvement, insisting that despite the problems in the relationship, he loved Karen and would never hurt her. He believed that the lawyer's attempts to place the blame on him were manipulation and lies. Besides, his alibi was indisputable. The prosecutor's office, for their part, argued that they had enough circumstantial evidence to convict Daniel. The main focus was on 2 hairs found in the bedroom that looked like Daniel's hair. While standard DNA tests did not yield an accurate result, a simplified testing technique was used, less accurate but able to exclude 99.8% of the population, leaving a few hundred or even thousands of potential owners. The prosecutor's office claimed that Daniel Moore was the only one of this circle of suspects who had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the murder. In February 2003, Daniel Moore began serving his sentence on death row at the Alabama Correctional Institution after being found guilty of premeditated murder on January 23rd and sentenced to death by injection. However, his fight for life was just beginning. An attorney immediately took on the job, and shortly after the sentencing, a new witness came forward. It turned out that Pam, a neighbor of the Tipton family, claimed to have seen Karen at the mailbox of the house around 3:30 p.m. She claimed that she called the police immediately afterward upon learning of Karen's death, but her message apparently got lost and was not recorded. Law enforcement officials confirmed that there was no record of the call. The prosecution believed the neighbor's testimony was not included in the case because of a possible timing error. The forensic examiner stated that at 3:30 a.m., Karen was already dead. If she had been alive, she could have left to pick up the children, making the neighbor's testimony questionable. The lawyer, on the other hand, was certain that the neighbor's testimony could not have disappeared by accident, since it clearly did not match the investigator's version of the story. This led him to believe that the prosecution had withheld some of the evidence from the beginning. A motion for a new trial was soon filed, which fundamentally changed Daniel's fate. The defense attorney discovered a 245-page FBI crime report on Karen Tipton. The prosecutor's office had previously denied the existence of this report, which turned out to be false. The document mentioned Karen's double life, including numerous extramarital affairs, which may have provided motivation for David and her lovers. This new information indicated that there were other possible suspects who were free to enter the house and commit the murder. David Tipton protested these claims, calling them hearsay rather than actual evidence. Some jurors began to question the fairness of the guilty verdict, a view shared by the sentencing judge. The judge accused the prosecutor and his assistant of deliberately withholding evidence, leading to the conviction of an innocent man. As a result of this unjust ruling, the judge signed the document that freed Daniel from death row in 2005. After years of struggle and litigation, Daniel Moore was once again in the spotlight of the law in 2011. This time, he was charged with burglary. A guilty plea resulted in 8 years in prison. When Moore was released from prison, questions about his true culpability in the murder of Karen Tipton remained unanswered. The crime that had rocked the small town was still considered unsolved. Meanwhile, in the shadows of this tangled story, the life of the victim's family continued. Immersed in his new existence, the man who used to be Karen's husband and now plays the role of loving father to their daughters remained a mystery. There is a disturbing hunch. Perhaps this man, hiding behind the mask of a caring parent, was actually involved in a horrific crime. Uncertainty and suspicion in this case continue to stir minds, and who knows, maybe the truth is yet to be revealed. Sometimes gambling with firearms leads to tragic events, the consequences of which are devastating for innocent people. Such games, full of bitter gambling risks, can turn into a disaster in an instant. At the same time, law enforcement negligence and carelessness can only compound the tragedy, making life a harrowing ordeal for those caught in the crossroads of inept investigation and carelessness. In this labyrinth of mystery and deceit, human destiny is held hostage to mistakes, from which sometimes there is no trace but grief and fear. At the center of this terrifying plot was one tragic accident that led to irreversible consequences, opening the veil over dark secrets and terrible truths. Despite all efforts and the best of intentions, sometimes the true criminals remain unseen and the innocent are jeopardized. In this story, filled with deep emotions and dark reflections, it is to find out who really hides behind the mask of innocence and who is responsible for the terrible events that have left their mark on the lives of many. But while the investigators conducted a thorough search, the invisible enemy has already begun to weave his net. Traps and tricks that could have been left to chance have already become part of a carefully planned game. Top forensic experts were brought into the case and began searching for microscopic particles of gunpowder in the building. They scrutinized windowsills, floors, and all surfaces, hoping to locate the exact spot from where the shot was fired. Unfortunately, a lot of time had passed. The room had already been cleaned several times, and the marks on the facade could have been washed away by the rains that had fallen the day after the incident. All rooms on several floors were searched. After about 3 hours of searching, a microscopic trace was found, 2 tiny particles of barium and antimony, which was immediately linked to a firearm. However, they were not found on the windowsill in the restroom, but on the floor above, in office number 6. The stain found on the windowsill in this office was thought to be gunpowder residue, although this could not be confirmed with certainty. The chemical composition of the substance was similar to printer's ink or burnt rubber. Despite the doubts, the investigators focused on room 6, as it was a suitable location from which the shooting could have taken place. Given the possible distortion of the bullet's trajectory, it could have been fired from almost anywhere on the campus facade, even the roof. However, police have learned who was in the office at the time of the alleged murder. The office was intended for the work of departmental assistants, and students and faculty could have been here. All of these people were interviewed. In the process, detectives noticed one oddity. All of those interviewed claimed that they were not in room number 6 at the time of the shooting. Investigators speculated that this could be an attempt by the conspirators to cover for each other. During a search of office number 6, they were able to find a cell phone from which a call was made at 11:44 a.m. on the day of the crime, just 2 minutes after the shooting. This trace led to a graduate student named Maria Chiara Lipari. She admitted to being in the room at the time of the call, but claimed that she did not see anyone with a gun and was not involved in the crime herself. She insisted that she didn't know Marta and had no motive to commit the crime, nor did she own a .22 caliber weapon. At this point, the police decided to pursue the version with room number 6 to the end. They decided to talk to Maria at the police station. Here she gave a rather confused testimony, changing her story several times. During the entire investigation, she was interviewed 13 times, and almost at every meeting she provided new information. After each interrogation, Maria complained that the investigators put a lot of pressure on her. Finally, she recalled that when she returned to her office to make a phone call, a man came out to meet her. He mumbled an inarticulate greeting, but Maria did not recognize him and just looked at him. However, this story soon changed. Maria got a confirmed alibi, which saved her from prosecution. She put her behavior down to fright and stress, and eventually she was taken off the list of suspects. Unfortunately, Maria's adventures were just beginning. The next suspect was Salvatore Ferrara, a philosophy and law assistant. He was pointed out to Maria, who immediately after the interrogation began to actively cooperate with the police. She was forced to do so under threat of indictment. According to Maria, he was exactly what the young man who came out of room number 6 when she entered looked like. But she doubted it until the last moment. The story kept changing, which could be attributed to the constant pressure on the girl. The first interrogation lasted 14 hours, and after that the investigators constantly approached her, applying pressure. It's hard to say whether Maria could be considered a reliable source of information, but the detectives were eager to find the culprit at any cost. To corroborate the witness's words, they conducted numerous interviews with other people connected to room 6. All of them gave confusing testimony that did not correspond to each other. And against this background, the investigators tried to link the information together. At one point, Bruno Romano, the university's director, intervened. He expressed his dissatisfaction with the work of the police and hinted at the irregularities observed. What alarmed him most was that the investigation refused to involve lawyers when dealing with witnesses, even at their urgent requests. This automatically made the director one of the suspects. The investigation now assumed that he was covering for the perpetrator to keep the university out of trouble. As one mistake leads to another, the investigation is plunged into chaos trying to find the culprit. And as the cops frantically search for clues, the real plot begins to emerge in the shadows of their own mistakes. The next person turns out to be Gabriella, the secretary to the head of the university. According to Maria, she too was in office number 6 before the shooting. Gabriella began to be seriously pressured, even threatened. In parallel, they installed a wiretap on the phone in the office where she worked, and there were even plans to install a hidden camera. During the dialogue with the investigators, she became a victim of outright threats. The secretary was told that if she did not turn over the perpetrator of the crime, she herself would be charged with the crime. For the 45-year-old woman, who had young children, the prospect of being jailed was devastating. Gabriella had taken up her position shortly before the events described, so she did not want to ruin her career and her life. She claimed she was far away from Room 6 and had no idea who might be involved in a cold-blooded murder. Moreover, she herself could not have fired the shot because of an illness she had suffered from for years. Detectives were so desperate to close the case that they even called in university medics to confirm the woman's illness. They conducted 9 interviews with her and even brought in her brother-in-law, who himself worked in law enforcement. Despite the family connection, he played bad cop and good cop against Gabriella, along with the rest of the investigators, to get a confession. At one point, the other detectives left the office, leaving Gabriella alone with her son-in-law. Even in this situation, he was unable to get a confession. The only thing the woman confessed to was that she was indeed in office number 6. The situation was aggravated by the fact that no lawyers were present during the interrogations. All these actions drove the secretary to despair. On June 11th, it was decided to arrest the director of the university, Bruno Romano. He was charged with aiding and abetting, as it was believed that he was covering for the criminal. Later, when criminal cases were brought against all those involved in the investigation for abuse of office, the prosecutor insisted that Romano's arrest was a ruse. It was supposed to scare those involved in the crime so that they would inevitably turn the perpetrator in. Gabriella's intimidation by the arrest of the leader was a turning point. She finally lost her temper and finally said that on the day of the murder, she saw 2 men in office number 6. One of them pulled out a gun when Martha Russo and her friend were between the room's window and the wall of the opposite campus. The man pulled the trigger, and the girl fell. Afterward, Gabriella said, the young men became confused. They clearly did not expect to kill a man and scattered in panic. From the beginning, Salvatore Ferrara and Giovanni Scode did not look like criminals capable of committing cold-blooded murder, even by accident. The investigators were not confused by the fact that they did not know Marta Russo and had no motive. The young people persistently denied their guilt, but the investigation had Gabriella's confession, hammered out under pressure at the interrogation, which was difficult to resist. A big problem for Salvatore were searches in his apartment, as there were found books on criminalistics, which talked about the ideal crime. The idea of realizing the perfect crime was immediately taken as the main motive. Salvatore insisted that the books were needed for his university research, but the investigators argued that forensics was not the purview of philosophers. In the end, it was decided to pick up another drawn-out explanation. It was believed that since the young man was interested in the perfect crime, then he simply decided to demonstrate his ability to commit it. However, there was still a catch. The detectives did not have the .22 caliber pistol that took Marta Russo's life. Despite the lack of a crime weapon, the detainees were brought to trial. So far, the trial and its outcome have raised many questions. It is impossible to say with certainty that the young people are guilty, as the case seems to be very controversial. Nevertheless, there are supporters who believe that justice has been done. People who suffered from the activities of police officers did not remain silent. Their dissatisfaction and statements against the detectives caused a lot of commotion. Internal investigations were launched. The words of the victims were backed up by weighty arguments. Numerous records of interrogations were used, including those on which threats from the investigators were recorded. The victims came forward with renewed vigor. Gabriella complained of intimidation that made her feel unsafe, as well as the absence of lawyers during interrogations. It was quite a risky move, as it was assumed that those police officers might have had support. Nevertheless, the appeal worked, and it was possible to launch a new investigation. But what was the cause of this nightmare? How could one unfortunate accident turn into a maze of lies, accusations, and dire consequences? Before we dive into the details of the investigation, let's go back to the beginning to understand what really happened. We'll take a look at those who became part of the story and learn how their fates intersected at this ominous moment. We will see that behind each person at the center of the events, there is a different story, different fears, and different motivations. So let's start at the beginning and reveal how this tragic day became the beginning of the most twisted and dark detective story imaginable. Marta Russo is a 22-year-old young and beautiful law student. She attended the prestigious La Sapienza University in Rome, dreaming of becoming a lawyer. Entering this ancient educational institution was her cherished dream, with which she walked for many years. Her future seemed bright, full of plans and ambitions, and her responsiveness and sociability made her popular among friends and classmates. Even her will stated that, should anything happen, she would be willing to donate her body for donation. The morning of May 9, 1997, began as usual for Martha. She walked around the university campus with her friend Yolanda Ritchie, carrying her textbooks and notebooks, discussing upcoming exams. They crossed the grounds of the faculties of statistics, politics, and law, and nothing portended trouble. However, at 11:42, Yolanda heard a suspicious clicking sound, and Martha suddenly fell to the ground unconscious. Yolanda speculated that it might have been a gunshot, but was not sure. Several witnesses immediately arrived at the scene. Although many doubted the plausibility of a shooting at such a time and place, their doubts were quickly dispelled when a pool of blood began to accumulate under Martha's head. Who would shoot a defenseless girl in the middle of a university campus that is always crowded? Upon examination, it was discovered that the bullet had struck Martha's left ear, penetrating her brain. Passers-by called an ambulance. The paramedics who arrived at the scene recognized the critical condition of the student and immediately took her to the hospital, where it was impossible to provide help on the spot. At the clinic, Marta fell into a coma. Her brain was shut down, but life was kept alive artificially while doctors hoped for a miracle. Her parents prayed that their daughter would regain consciousness, but the medics realized that the chances of recovery tended to zero. Even in the event of a miraculous awakening, Martha would likely remain confined to a wheelchair for life. Meanwhile, forensics focused on the crime scene. It was an open area between two university buildings. On either side of the passageway were building facades with windows, and across from them was a blank wall. Along the edges were sparse trees that could partially obstruct the view. The detective's first task was to find out exactly where the perpetrator had been at the time of the shooting. Martha's friend Yolanda turned out to be the only witness who heard the suspicious sound. However, she was unable to pinpoint its source because the popping sound was too quiet. In addition, during Martha's first aid treatment, her body was moved several times, making it difficult to establish the exact location of the accident. This uncertainty made it difficult for detectives to determine the bullet's trajectory and the shooter's location. Realizing that they needed to figure out who Martha was in order to figure out who her enemy might have been, police began to look into her life. They hypothesized that perhaps she might have been involved with someone dangerous or accidentally found herself in conflict with a potential criminal. But their expectations were not justified. Martha turned out to be an ordinary, decent girl with no criminal connections. Her biography did not reveal any suspicious connections, and she was surrounded by the same students and friends. Lately, Martha had been focused solely on her studies and had no relationships. Even her diary entries were checked, but nothing suspicious was found there either. Without giving up hope, the investigators assumed that the killer's real target could have been her friend Yolanda, and that Marta had been the victim of a random attack. This assumption was based on the strange events of the last few days. Yolanda reported that she had received 45 anonymous phone calls that were highly suspicious. She answered one of these calls, but there was silence for 23 seconds. In addition, a stranger called Yolanda's father on his home phone and caused an all-night scandal, insulting his daughter but not identifying himself. These disturbing events attracted the attention of investigators, who began to consider the version of a possible connection between Yolanda and the incident. Against the backdrop of all these events, the police began to consider the theory that the perpetrator had originally aimed at another victim, probably Yolanda, but mistakenly hit Marta. An alternative hypothesis was that the attack could have been an act of revenge against Yolanda's father. The man was a powerful official who ran several prisons. Perhaps the murder of his daughter was revenge on the part of a former prisoner who harbored a grudge against him. All of these theories were scrutinized by detectives, but ultimately found unlikely. Despite the presence of enemies of Yolanda's father, there was no concrete indication that anyone would have massacred his family. The situation was complicated by the fact that the university where the incident occurred had its own grim reputation. Throughout its history, it had been the scene of faction uprisings and spontaneous attacks more than once. Despite the fact that it was an educational institution, such incidents happened here with enviable regularity. However, until the case of Martha and Yolanda, none of these incidents had been so cold-blooded and senseless. The university had already had the unfortunate experience of terrorist attacks. On February 12, 1980, for example, unknown assailants opened fire on the lobby of one of the academic buildings where the professor was staying. He was killed by 7 bullets. This attack was not the first of its kind. The political situation of the time was tense and crime was quite common, connected with the activities of the so-called Red Brigades. On March 27, 1985, a new case occurred. A university professor of economics fell victim to unknown criminals. All these crimes were taken by the Red Brigades, who officially recognized their responsibility. These actions were part of their political struggle, but events like the attack on Marta were of a different nature and seemed particularly brutal and senseless. However, against the background of all these events, the murder of Marta, and even more so of Yolanda in 1997, looked like a completely senseless act of retaliation. The coincidence of the date, May 9th, when the world remembered the anniversary of the discovery of the body of Aldo Moro, a well-known activist of political movements, drew particular attention. On such a day, perhaps the Red Brigades could have tried to repeat their previous terrorist actions. However, this time no one claimed responsibility for the attack on Marta Russo. It seemed illogical. Politically, it would have been more justified to eliminate a university professor than an ordinary student. With each passing day, the investigation sank into greater obscurity. Doctors desperately fought for the life of the young student, who continued to be on the verge of death. During surgery, a surgeon recovered a 22mm caliber bullet from her head. This find was immediately sent to a laboratory for analysis. At the time, ballistics experts suggested that the faint gunshot noise could have been caused either by the use of a silencer or by the use of a small caliber weapon, such as a rifle or pistol. This type of weapon makes only a faint sound that is almost indistinguishable at long range. Some facts matched. The .22 caliber round is widely used in sport shooting and has relatively low killing power while making less noise than more powerful ammunition. Forensic investigators continued to reconstruct the bullet's trajectory to refine the possible points from which the shot could have been fired. However, because Martha's body had been moved multiple times, the investigation was faced with a lack of accurate information. Forensics was only able to establish the trajectory with a certain margin of error, but suggested that the shooter was probably in the building opposite to where the victim was. The sniper must have been shooting from a window. Analysis showed that the potential shooting location was in the bathroom of the building adjacent to the statistics department classrooms. At a time when there were few students, this location allowed the shooter to operate virtually undetected and quickly escape without attracting attention. The day after the attack, additional information emerged that confirmed this version. One of the statistics students came to the station and reported that after the attack on the girl, he went into the bathroom and noticed that the window was wide open, although it was usually always closed. Detectives focused on a thorough search of the area, including the street below the window. They soon discovered a bullet casing that they had not noticed the first day because it was under the car. To the experts' surprise, this shell casing did not match the bullet that killed Martha. Upon further examination of the wall near the crime scene, investigators found numerous bullet holes. It turned out that the students had been using the bathroom as a sort of shooting range, firing into the wall. The constant practice of shooting in this location explained the presence of shell casings and holes discovered during the investigation. While examining the bathroom, police stumbled upon another small room nearby that served as a storage area for a cleaning company that does cleaning work for the university. Given the estimated trajectory of the bullet, detectives began to consider this room as a possible location from which the gunshot could have originated. However, access to the room was blocked from the start, and investigators were unable to immediately examine it. Upon further investigation, it was discovered that employees of the cleaning company were passionate about guns and had licenses that allowed them to keep and use them. This created a situation where others could access the weapons even without their own license. In addition to the cleaning equipment, they also found an ammunition storage area on the premises. It contained a large number of weapons, including silencers and ammunition of various calibers. One of the interesting things was that the cleaning company's employees were not normally working between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. The attack on Martha occurred at 11:42 a.m., which falls exactly within that time frame. Investigators began questioning all employees of the cleaning company, but each of them provided alibis to exclude themselves as suspects. After checking alibis and further investigation, it became clear that the cleaning company employees had not broken the law. All gun owners were licensed, and the rifles and handguns were registered. The employees confirmed that they sometimes used the wall of the opposite building as a shooting range, but that they did so exclusively from the storage area and were strict about not firing when people were in the vicinity. Marta Russo's mother confessed that on that fateful morning she had a kind of anxious premonition that she could not get rid of. At first, the woman did not pay much attention to it, but everything changed when she received a call from the police. Martha's death triggered a sharp rise in public pressure on the police. This came against the backdrop of several high-profile failures that had seriously damaged the reputation of Roman law enforcement. Urgent and decisive action was required to restore lost confidence. The situation led to hasty and disruptive action on the part of the police. One of the first suspects was a 36-year-old librarian named Gonzales. He was brought into the investigation because of suspicious internet searches related to the creation of homemade silencers for firearms. He was also in possession of a .22 caliber rifle and a silencer. Despite this, however, Gonzales was able to provide an ironclad alibi. He was in the auditorium at the time of the shooting, and multiple witnesses confirmed his presence there. As a result, the librarian was ruled out as a suspect. By this point, due to public pressure, the police were trying to assign a guilty party. However, this was unsuccessful because of the reliable alibis of all the suspects. One witness admitted that the weapon was in the hands of Salvatore Ferrara, and she identified the second suspect as Giovanni Scottu, a 29-year-old philosophy assistant. With this new information, detectives were finally able to connect all the pieces of the investigation, and the crime picture became clearer. During the trial, Salvatore Ferrara and Giovanni Scotta remained calm and did not deny their innocence. There was no direct evidence against them, but the prosecutor's office insisted that they were violent criminals and used all possible methods to prove it. The prosecution presented testimony that had been beaten out of Gabriella's secretary, although the jury did not know it. The court discussed the gunpowder residue on the windowsill of office number 6 and the trajectory of the bullet's flight, ignoring the fact that this evidence was inaccurate and strained. Prosecution witnesses, long under duress, testified against the defendants. Court pictures and Gabriella and Maria's speeches showed their fear and excitement, reminiscent of the state of frightened people. A key witness for the prosecution was a security guard, Francesco Liparot, who claimed to have seen the defendants in office number 6. Although this guard had been a suspect for some time, he agreed to cooperate with the police, and all charges against him were dropped. Maurizio Bascio and Maria Urilli stated in court that they saw the defendants run out of the university after the shooting. However, this did not prove their involvement in the shooting. The students' defense attorneys cited evidence that the particles found on the windowsill were not related to a firearm, but rather to exhaust from a car. This meant that the firing point could have been another window, and therefore other people. The defense also argued that the witnesses' testimony was far-fetched. Unfortunately, on May 14th, medics turned off the equipment keeping Martha alive, and she was officially pronounced dead. After 5 days in a coma, Martha was never able to return to life. In accordance with her last will, her parents and sister donated her organs for donation. About 10,000 people gathered at Martha's funeral. Among them were not only family and friends, but also many students and local residents who came to express their sympathy and sorrow for this tragedy. At the end of the trial, experts concluded that Martha Russo's death was the result of an accidental incident. The shooting occurred by mistake during the game when a series of ricochets accidentally hit the girl's head. It was ruled manslaughter. At the end of the trial in 2001, both defendants were found guilty. Giovanni Scott was sentenced to 7 years in prison for manslaughter and possession of a firearm, while his accomplice Salvatore Ferrara received 4 years. The charges against the tortured woman were dropped, and the university director was acquitted of the charges. However, the convicts appealed, and their sentences were reviewed. The Supreme Court upheld the manslaughter charge for Giovanni, but dropped the illegal weapons charge. As a result, Giovanni was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment instead of 7, and was ordered to pay court costs of 300,000 euros. To date, the convicts have long since been released and have gone on with their lives. Giovanni Scott, now a philosophy teacher in Rome, had to give up many career opportunities because of his criminal record. Now in his 50s, he leads a quiet life with his family and maintains a normal lifestyle. Salvatore Ferrara, who became a lawyer, continues to work actively in his field. He writes books, participates in television shows, and helps those who have suffered injustice and abuse. Despite their best efforts, the convicts have been unable to challenge the court's decision and get punishment for the detectives, who some believe may have played a role in the miscarriage of justice. However, the most disturbing aspect of this whole story is that if indeed there was a miscarriage of justice, the real culprit was never found. It is possible that right now he could be targeting a new victim, innocent and unsuspecting. As for organ donation, to avoid additional pain for Martha's family, it was decided to make an exception. The victim's mother was able to embrace a woman who's been alive for 20 years thanks to her daughter's heart. This noble decision made it possible to keep a piece of Marta in these people, despite all the tragedy that had befallen them. The Lissi family tragedy. What drove a devoted family man to the brink? How can one identify a psychopath? Let's delve into what this term encompasses. Psychopathy is a personality disorder marked by distinctive traits such as a lack of empathy and compassion, emotional shallowness, egocentrism, and a deceitful charm. While not an exhaustive list, these qualities are commonly observed in psychopaths. Such individuals are adept at adapting, skillfully manipulating those around them, and expertly concealing their true nature, often to the extent that even those closest to them may not recognize the potential danger. The Lissi family's story serves as a chilling reminder that someone perceived as a loving and close family member can suddenly morph into a remorseless perpetrator, sparing not even their own children. The man's behavior and his stated motives for committing such a heinous act were so alarming and shocking that they raised questions about his sanity. Yet, to everyone's astonishment, a psychiatric evaluation revealed that he was fully aware of his actions and had premeditated the horrific crime. This case shook Italy to its core, particularly the serene province of Motta Visconti, where this tragedy unfolded, marking it as the most notorious crime in the small Milanese suburb's history. Now, let's methodically unravel this story and attempt to trace the sequence of events that led to such a tragic conclusion. The tragedy in Motta Visconti. In the early hours of Saturday, June 14, 2014, the quiet town of Motta Visconti was awakened by the desperate cries of a man. Peering out their windows, residents saw their neighbor, 31-year-old Carlo Lissi, calling for help. He appeared frightened and disoriented, mumbling incoherently, and pleading for someone to call the police. As people from nearby homes gathered, Carlo revealed that his entire family had been victimized by intruders who had broken into their home, while he had miraculously survived because he was out with friends at a local sports bar, watching the soccer match between Italy and England. He mentioned that everything seemed normal when he left his house earlier that night, but upon returning, he found his home in disarray and the lifeless bodies of his 38-year-old wife, Christina, their 5-year-old daughter, and their 1.5-year-old son. Neighbors immediately called the police and emergency medical services. While waiting for them to arrive, the operator asked Carlo to check if any of his family members had a pulse and to possibly start CPR if there were any signs of life. To this, he screamed that he wouldn't step inside his house again or touch the bodies. While his behavior could be attributed to shock, it was peculiar that he referred to his family members as bodies, even before confirming their demise. Carlo's odd behavior didn't stop there. When police and medical personnel arrived and confirmed the deaths of his wife and children, he barely reacted. He attempted to cry but only managed contorted facial expressions, with his eyes remaining dry and his face almost indifferent. He struggled to recall the sequence of his actions, gave conflicting statements, but claimed to have recorded the moment he discovered the bodies on his phone's camera. He believed the recording would prove his innocence, but it turned out to be one of the main pieces of evidence against him, among many others. This was the beginning of a high-profile case that was quickly solved. The robbery narrative, strongly advocated by Lisi, was dismissed within hours of the investigation, and he became the prime suspect. As the police uncovered more physical evidence at the scene of the crime and interacted further with Carlo, doubts about his mental health began to emerge. Who was Cristina Lisi? Let's start this narrative by introducing its main characters. Cristina Lisi, born Cristina Omas, came into the world on September 17, 1975, in the small northern Italian town of Pavia, becoming the eldest child in her family. From a young age, she exhibited a strong-willed, independent, and highly ambitious nature, always marching to the beat of her own drum. She possessed leadership qualities and was constantly striving to excel in whatever she undertook, whether it was her schoolwork, performances in the drama club, or any day-to-day activities. Cristina was someone who always had a wide circle of friends, thanks to her excellent organizational skills and the ability to lead. After finishing high school, she was accepted into a prestigious university in Milan and soon moved out of her parents' home to start an independent life. Despite this, she maintained a close relationship with her family, staying in constant touch, and her parents knew they could always rely on their eldest daughter. At the age of 19, while still attending university, Cristina took a job at a branch of a major Italian insurance company located in Motta Visconti. She quickly earned the respect of her superiors and colleagues, and her career was on a fast track to success. Upon graduation, she had a wide array of opportunities before her, but instead of moving to a big city, Omas chose to stay closer to home in the countryside. By this time, she had already received a promotion at work and assumed a managerial position, becoming a leading specialist in the field of civil insurance. However, even as she grew into an adult and a successful woman, Cristina never gave up her youthful passion for theater. She dedicated all her spare time to rehearsals and performing on stage, particularly enjoying musical productions due to her strong voice and impeccable musical ear. In Motta Visconti, she had her admirers and was sometimes even recognized on the streets. Yet Cristina's personal life didn't seem to fall into place as smoothly. She had many suitors and occasional romances, but most of the men she encountered seemed frivolous, unreliable, and unsuitable for a serious relationship or family life. She held on to the belief that she would eventually find her true love and achieve happiness. Carlo Lisi, the unassuming psychopath. Carlo Lisi entered the world in the fall of 1982 in the Italian commune of Casarano as the eldest of two sons in his family. The family patriarch held conservative views, was quite strict, and even harsh with his children. Carlo's younger brother quickly became the parents' darling, constantly pampered and protected, while they demanded unquestioning obedience, stellar academic performance, and high achievements from their firstborn. From childhood, Carlo strived to meet his parents' expectations, always acting as instructed. He excelled academically, participated in volleyball, a sport his father chose for him despite Carlo's passion for soccer, and never argued with his father, who often stated that his house operated solely on his rules. It was easy to upset or anger their father, who became terrifying when enraged, so Carlo made it a point never to contradict him, always enviously observing his father's and mother's more affectionate treatment towards his younger brother. As a teenager, Carlo became nervous and withdrawn, dreaming of doing something on his own, yet fearing his father's wrath. His fears, internal struggles, and self-doubt affected his relationships with peers. Carlo had almost no friends at school, where he was seen as an uninteresting nerd, often openly bullied without the ability to defend himself, as his father had crushed his self-esteem and suppressed any desire to assert himself. Over time, Carlo learned to adapt and blend in. He avoided conflicts, tried to merge with the crowd, and was superficially polite and kind, even to those he despised. It seemed Carlo had lost his own emotions, or perhaps never had them, laughing or mourning with others, But his emotional responses always remained shallow because he never truly felt those emotions. Another trait of Carlo was his skill in dodging uncomfortable questions. He wasn't a pathological liar, but knew how to prevaricate and evade with such an impassive demeanor that it seemed he was speaking the truth. People who knew Carlo personally later recalled his diminished capacity for empathy. He could be described as callous and indifferent to the troubles and sorrows of others, including those close to him. After finishing school, Lissi enrolled in a prestigious university's economics faculty, chosen by his father, despite Carlo's disinterest in economics or working with numbers. But his opinion was never sought, and he couldn't challenge his father's decision. Thus, Carlo was accustomed to acting against his own interests just to meet others' expectations. Carlo was quite handsome and knew how to use it to his advantage. His youthful sports activities and regular gym visits in adulthood made him even more attractive. Coupled with some charm and superficial charisma, Carlo could be described as a real looker with a dazzling smile and athletic build. People often admired his looks, leading to excessive self-love and clinical narcissism. Lissi easily initiated flings with women, but was incapable of engaging in serious, long-term relationships. First, he tried to avoid any responsibility. Second, he had no interest in making long-term plans, simply going with the flow. And third, his partners soon realized he was emotionally shallow and devoid of real attachment, leading them often to initiate the breakup. Even after university, the young man continued living with his parents, showing no desire to start an independent life, let alone a family of his own. Meanwhile, he secured a job at a leading IT company in Milan. Carlo earned a good salary and faced broad prospects but remained dissatisfied with his career. However, his parents were overjoyed, and his father seemed proud of his eldest son for the first time, so Carlo was too afraid to disappoint him, preferring to avoid conflicts and criticism. But soon, a good job and career achievements weren't enough. His parents increasingly pressured him to marry and provide them with grandchildren. Aware of his numerous fleeting affairs and his inability to maintain serious relationships, these discussions often led to arguments at home. As Carlo always tried to avoid confrontations, he assured them he would soon find a wife and start a family. Carlo and Cristina Lissi, a love story. Carlo first laid eyes on Cristina during her performance in a musical play on stage, where he was utterly captivated by her powerful charisma and stunning vocal talent. Despite his immediate fascination, he lacked the courage to approach her after the show. However, fate intervened a few weeks later when mutual friends introduced them. At the time of their meeting, Carlo was only 23, while Cristina had already turned 30. Despite the significant age difference, they quickly developed a romantic relationship. Cristina, who had previously focused mainly on her career, found herself unexpectedly wanting to build a family and have children with Carlo. He was handsome, career-oriented, and intelligent. Cristina perceived his hesitancy, dependency, noticeable selfishness, and some emotional coldness as traits that could be mended. She took the initiative in their relationship, with Carlo compliantly following her lead. Just a few months into the relationship, Omas introduced Carlo to her family. Cristina's parents, however, were not pleased with her choice. They saw her suitor as frivolous, with Cristina's mother describing him as a child in a man's body. She believed her daughter needed a more emotionally mature partner who could be a reliable support, not this immature young man. Cristina, however, disagreed and decided to follow her heart, as she always had. Conversely, Carlo's parents were thrilled with his choice. Cristina was seen as an adult, wise, self-sufficient, and accomplished woman who could take care of herself and their indecisive, somewhat irresponsible son. The head of the family, who was not easily pleased, was particularly delighted, convincing Carlo further that he had made the right decision. In quiet waters. About a year after meeting, the young couple moved in together and started actively planning their wedding. Carlo was quiet and compliant, always listening to his fiancée, never contradicting her, and carefully avoiding domestic disputes. Cristina made all the decisions while her chosen partner silently supported them. This arrangement suited her perfectly. She was confident that a long and happy life awaited them. However, just before their wedding, Carlo revealed his true nature for the first time, nearly causing them to split. Before the wedding, Carlo's friends threw him a bachelor party in one of Milan's popular nightclubs. They drank, had fun, and were having a great time when a group of women joined them. One of them showed a keen interest in the groom-to-be, trying her best to seduce him. His inebriated friends immediately egged him on, suggesting that a fleeting affair with the stranger would be the perfect adventure to bid farewell to his bachelor life. Without much thought, the guy went off to a hotel with the woman, where they spent a passionate night. The next morning, unexpectedly, Carlo confessed his love to the casual lover and promised to leave his fiancée for her. That same day, he confessed everything to Cristina, stating he had fallen for someone else and no longer wanted the wedding. Cristina handled the news with dignity, packed her belongings, and decided to move back to her parents' house temporarily while finding her own place. But when Carlo's father learned about his son's actions and that the engagement with Cristina was broken off by his initiative, he was furious. He declared he didn't want to see his heir until he apologized to the bride-to-be and convinced her to marry him again. Once again, Carlo submitted to his father's will. After buying a huge bouquet of flowers, he headed to the Omas residence. Cristina's parents opposed him. They had disliked this peculiar young man even before the news of his infidelity and the broken engagement, and now they certainly didn't want to see him. But the final decision was Cristina's to make. After some thought, she decided to forgive her fiancé and give him another chance. The wedding and Mr. Lissi's double life. The wedding took place as planned, and the money gifted by relatives was invested in buying their own home in Monte Visconti. Initially, their marital life seemed quite blissful. Both held high-ranking positions with substantial salaries, affording them not just the necessities but also travel, entertainment, and more. In 2009, they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Giulia, and in 2013, Cristina gave birth to a son, Gabriel. To the outside world, they appeared as a happy family, full of love and understanding. Carlo seemed to do everything to please his wife, not out of deep love or respect, but rather to avoid disputes. Cristina was content with their life together, oblivious to the double life her husband led. At home, he was the exemplary family man, spending time with his wife and kids. Yet, in Milan, where Carlo commuted daily for work, he transformed entirely. He frequently engaged in flings and casual encounters, meeting women in cafes, shopping centers, or even on the street. The handsome, stylishly dressed man in his expensive car almost always received reciprocated interest. But these affairs typically ended after a few dates. Carlo enjoyed the control and dominance in these short-term relationships, deciding when to see his next conquest and when to leave her. At home, Cristina held the reins, with Carlo merely following her lead. However, rumors of his escapades eventually reached Cristina. Each time she confronted him, Carlo swore it was all lies and slander. In 2013, shortly after the birth of their second child, Carlo seriously considered leaving his family for one of his mistresses, to the point of admitting his intentions to his wife. Cristina countered with compelling arguments against their separation, particularly highlighting how it would upset his parents. Carlo had no choice but to concede to her reasoning. New love and a horrific plan to escape marital ties. A year later, in early 2014, a new employee named Maria, young and attractive, joined Carlo's workplace. He fell for her instantly, unable to think of anyone else. He tried everything to catch her attention, giving small gifts, complimenting her, and asking her out repeatedly. However, Maria was clear about not wanting to engage with a married co-worker who had 2 children. But Carlo, persistent in his pursuit, seemed to ignore her protests and didn't think of giving up. Moreover, Carlo began to blame his family for his unhappiness, believing his wife and children were obstacles to his personal joy. He convinced himself he had never been happy in his marriage, or in life for that matter. But with Maria, he imagined he could have the perfect relationship, if only he wasn't bound by his marital ties and responsibilities as a father. The more he dwelled on this thought, the darker his contemplations became. Carlo broached the subject of divorce again, but his wife once more convinced him it was a bad idea, and he found no arguments to counter hers. Frustrated, he started looking online for divorce lawyers, but realized after a few consultations that he would have to surrender half of his assets to Cristina and also pay child support. Unwilling to accept such an outcome, he began researching how to end a person's life quickly and without arousing suspicion. Delving into various criminal stories, Carlo stumbled upon an article about an armed robbery that had occurred a few years prior in Monte Visconti. The robbers had fatally stabbed the homeowner before fleeing with the loot, remaining undetected to this day. A monstrous plan took shape in Carlo's mind to recreate a similar robbery scenario, but this time, the intended victims would be the mother and children. For months, he meticulously studied human anatomy and cold weapons, ensuring his planned actions would leave no chance for survival for the condemned family members. During this period, Carlo transformed into the model husband and father, showering his wife and children with warmth and care they had never received from him before. Christina was overjoyed, thinking her husband had matured, unaware that he had doomed her and the children to a tragic fate. The last day of the Lissi family. The final day for Christina and her children was Friday, June 13th, 2014. Carlo, having the day off, spent it with his family, orchestrating a sort of farewell celebration. They visited an amusement park together, went shopping at a mall, and ended the evening at a popular local cafe. Carlo made sure they were seen by as many people as possible to demonstrate their apparent happiness. Returning home, the couple put their children to bed upstairs and then went downstairs to the living room where they were intimate. This was part of Carlo's sinister plan to divert suspicion from himself. He knew that an examination would confirm mutual consent, leading no one to suspect that he would suddenly end the lives of his wife and children. Christina, aware that her husband planned to watch football with friends, thought he was getting dressed, while she settled in the living room by the TV. Meanwhile, Carlo went to the kitchen, grabbed a large knife, and stealthily approached Christina from behind. He struck her on the side of the neck, but Christina remained conscious and attempted to flee. It seemed she didn't immediately realize who her attacker was. Upon seeing her enraged husband with the knife, she was utterly shocked. She tried to defend herself and knock the knife away, causing Carlo to slip and injure his palm. Despite her efforts, the strength disparity was too great. Carlo continued his assault until Christina showed no signs of life. She died without understanding why her loved one could commit such a horrific act. Then, Carlo went upstairs and cut the throats of his sleeping 5-year-old daughter and his 18-month-old son. Experts later concluded that the children likely did not suffer and probably didn't even wake up. Neighbors, some of whom heard loud screams, did not call the police, thinking the noise quickly subsided. Had they been more vigilant, the children's lives might have been saved. After completing the deed, Carlo clumsily staged a robbery, slightly moving and scattering items, erased his fingerprints from the weapon, cleaned the floor where he had stepped in fresh blood, and then went to a rarely used basement shower to wash off the blood. However, he inexplicably put back on the same underwear, which had small blood splatters unnoticed by him in the moment of the attack. Following this, the perpetrator bandaged his cut hand, dressed up, and casually went to a sports bar to watch football and drink beer with friends. He behaved naturally, and his friends, later testifying in court, could not fathom that he had just committed a triple homicide against his own family. Towards the end of the match, Carlo sent a couple of messages to his wife's phone, updating her on the score and professing his love, adding that he would be home soon. He returned around 3 a.m. and staged a dramatic discovery of the crime, making several critical mistakes. Firstly, he recorded the scene on his phone's camera, intending to create an alibi by pretending to discover the disorder and then the body of his wife, before running outside in panic. His second mistake was failing to turn off the camera, resulting in footage that completely contradicted his alibi and testimony. Investigation and evidence. Carlo's initial claim of a robbery was quickly dismissed in the early hours of the investigation, following the crime scene examination. Doors and windows were intact, indicating that the perpetrator had unrestricted access to the house. Nothing of value nor anything at all was missing despite money and Christina's jewelry box being in plain sight. The disorder appeared staged, with items merely toppled or displaced rather than searched through. Most importantly, there was no logical reason for robbers to harm the children sleeping upstairs in their beds. Thus, the case was swiftly reclassified as a deliberate act of ending lives. Carlo, becoming the prime suspect immediately, gave inconsistent statements and couldn't clearly explain the fresh cut on his palm. When he was taken into custody and his clothing was sent for analysis, experts quickly found tiny blood splatters on them. However, Carlo claimed the blood must have come from when he attempted to revive his family members. Yet the stains were too small and located on the back of his clothing, suggesting they could only have originated from the knife's motion during the act. Regarding the video Carlo provided to the authorities, it clearly showed that he didn't approach his wife's body to check for a pulse or go upstairs to the children, but ran outside immediately and didn't return. Despite this, he claimed his family was no longer alive and knew for certain all three were ended with a knife. The discovery of a bloodied cloth in the trash, which the culprit used to clean up, was the final piece of damning evidence. The psychopath's rationality. After his arrest, Carlo ceased all pretenses of grief. He became calm and indifferent, simply going to sleep once placed in his cell. He showed no guilt or remorse for his actions, not mourning for his wife or children, yet he continued to insist on his innocence despite overwhelming evidence against him. Investigators recovered his laptop's search history, revealing when Carlo began plotting to end his family members' lives. It left no doubt that the act was premeditated, but his motive remained unclear until he started to confess. His explanation for the act shocked everyone. He said he couldn't just divorce Christina because it would mean dividing their substantial assets, including their home, cars, and savings, which he found unacceptable. Furthermore, he viewed his children as a burden requiring child support payments, obstacles to the happy life he envisioned with Maria. He discussed these motives with a chilling detachment. This calm and indifferent recounting of events confirmed Carlo's psychopathic nature. But whether he was sane was debatable. A psychiatric evaluation determined that Carlo was fully aware of his actions and their implications, but experienced no remorse or guilt, either during or after the crime. In January 2015, Carlo was sentenced to life in prison. He received the judge's verdict with indifference, merely commenting that he had expected as much. Later, he attempted to appeal the decision but soon withdrew it, concluding it was futile. Lastly, it's worth noting that Carlo's father passed away from a heart attack shortly after his son was sentenced, unable to come to terms with having raised a creature devoid of compassion and remorse.